Preamble. I don't like this game. If you're looking for a positive take on the Final Fantasy VII Remake, then this will not be the video for you. There are several aspects I'll be cautiously optimistic about, especially when discussing the inevitable sequel, and there are some moments and sequences I enjoyed, but the majority of this video is going to be pretty harsh criticism. This is also my second video on the game. 1 year ago, I posted a very raw, passionate critique. Since it's my first analytical video, I'm not too annoyed that most of it sucks, but if you want my initial, honest, and much more blunt reactions to my first time playing through the game, then that would be the one for you. It doesn't have any relevant footage either, so you can just listen to it in the background as well. Now though, with my style a bit more refined, with better equipment, and armed with 1 whole year of jaded cynicism toward this game, I'm ready to give it another go to try and give it its fair shake. Well, I say that, but this most recent playthrough actually marks my 4th, at least in game time. I played up through most of Chapter 9 initially, had to change accounts, and then I played through it again from the start. I then made the first video, but after that I played through it a second time to try and give the gameplay another chance almost immediately after. Already, that's 2.5 playthroughs. Fast forward to now, where... well, I'll get into it much later. This video will cover both the Final Fantasy VII Remake almost in its entirety, as well as the equivalent portion of the original game to a lesser extent. I'll discuss the presentation, the story, the gameplay, the progression and pacing that goes into them, and then go through each chapter and area and give my impressions. And despite all of the complaints I'll level at this game, overall I would say to try it. For better or worse, it's become something of a phenomenon. It's arguably the most anticipated remake of all time after all. And I will acknowledge that I am in a very small minority with my vehement disdain. For all of the above reasons, I think you should try it yourself, and draw your own conclusions. As well, again despite my problems with it, it was clear that at least the majority of the developers really cared and were passionate about making the best product they could, in addition to the localization team which did an absolutely phenomenal job 99% of the time. And supporting passionate creators and translators is never a bad thing in my opinion. But for those of you who have already drawn those conclusions and are curious for mine, let's get started with the Final Fantasy VII Remake. Part 1. Presentation. So this is going to be the only section that isn't somehow tied into the sections around it. The others kind of semi-naturally flow into one another, but this one is kind of on its own. A lot of people say that this game looks good. I would tell those people to get their eyes checked. To start positive, the atmosphere, music, and general aesthetic of the game are immaculate. Midgar has never felt more alive than in this game, and I think that the presentation is on par with the best Square Enix has ever put out. A particularly great touch is just how cluttered everything is in the slums. While it is fairly unrealistic, especially in Sector 5 where there are those kids that supposedly pick up litter, the junk lying around does serve well to give a lived-in feelings to these different zones. As well, the contrast between them and every location topside is just great. I think that the Shinra building, before you go into the underground testing part, is my favorite building level in any game, aesthetically speaking. It's just so well realized, and I have nothing but praise for, if not the execution, then the intent, and they were at least partially successful with the execution as well. But on the other hand, my god, are there some goddamn awful textures everywhere you look in this game. When I play games and make videos on them, I take notes as I play, which, side note, if you ever see me just randomly stop in the footage, I'm probably taking notes. And I had 34 videos of footage, each roughly an hour long. All in all, my notes are 12 pages long, with a word count of 2450 exactly. I Control-F'd that shit and put in texture, and came up with 16 individual results. To note, I found far more bad textures than that, but those are the ones that I just had to write down. And I have done some small amount of research on the subject. It seems to be that the game has high-res textures in the files, but the scripting or whatever just doesn't ever let them load in. Either way, high-res textures existing or not, it's still a problem with the visuals, which are otherwise pretty good. Pipes, ladders, mounds of trash, those road wire things, the doors... oh my god, you see so many doors up close, and all of them look like such trash. What were they thinking? As well, at times when you're high up or can see far into the distance, the JPEGs that they use look just atrocious as well. They don't move naturally with your movements, though from that distance they probably shouldn't move at all, which is still a problem because they do, and they're just so low res and clash so hard when you position some in-game modeled texture in front of them. It's just so bad. Getting away from bitching about textures and more onto the UI and what's actually important when playing a game, I'll say that I don't think the health bars should disappear outside of combat. As is, if enough time passes, the health bars kind of fold back down into their drop bar. And it is as simple as pressing X to bring up the menu, and thus the health bars, but that immediately cuts off your sprint, which is another small annoyance in a sea of other small annoyances I'll get into momentarily. I personally found the camera to be really bad as well. It's been too long to know if I'm using the default settings or if I was ever informed about the settings at all, but you can set all kinds of parameters to how you want the camera to function. You can set it so the camera gradually repositions behind the character you're controlling, and set it so that if you target an off-screen enemy, it shifts to show them. I'm not sure how effective these are, but since I turned them off, I have to assume they were shit. Or otherwise the game didn't inform me that they were an option, which is an issue in and of itself. As it is though, I don't think they would have helped. If anything, they probably would have added to my problems. There were several points where the character I was controlling was attacked, shot back into a wall, and the camera was just kind of stuck there until I moved, which sometimes I couldn't do. So my character went transparent, the enemies were continuing to attack me, and it was just never a fun time. To talk about the in-battle UI, I would call it passable. I think that the aesthetic is really boring and blocky and computerized, which I'm sure they were going for, but I really liked the feature seen in the original game and others where you can tweak the window color to what you like. As you can see, I went for a kind of purple motif with my 4.5 hour playthrough of the Midgar section. Anyway, the health bars are easy enough to see, the ATB bar is easy enough to see, and the commands are likewise all easy enough to see. There's even a useful mechanic where the screen turns a shade of red whenever one of your party falls to critical health, which is useful in the heat of the moment. The issues only really come up in moments of chaos. Now, if you're just fighting one single enemy like a boss, it's usually fine, but damn! Fighting like 6 guys and having 6 itty-bitty little attack names pop up before they all bum rush you kind of feels bad. In addition to the small, often hard to read text, especially in the heat of the moment, I found that there were little to no audio cues for these attacks, and I would have appreciated those and a bit better of a sound mix to better get into the fights. And on the sound mix, I am aware that you can adjust it, but given that the options all start at 10 and my music and sound effects were equal at 7, the point stands. If they're all balanced equally, then you still don't get an indication. The sound effects overpower the music and the voices, even with my settings, and the former is a real shame because the orchestration at play here is just phenomenal. Almost all of the song remixes were great, though I personally preferred the original tracks myself. Nobuo Uematsu and his team of crack composers really outdid themselves here with these original tunes, and while the remixed tracks sometimes felt like they were just going through the motions, when they hit hard. Tifa's theme is a fantastic remix. And the Turks have 3 great themes.
Hello, Aerith.
What do you want?
With them in cutscenes, when you're rushing to stop them from dropping the plate, and when you fight them. And let's not forget about those original pieces either. Jessie's new theme that plays as you go to her house, S65 Road, aka Midnight Rendezvous, which plays just after Aerith ambushes Cloud on his way back to Sector 7. And of course, the Ghoul/Abzu/Leviathan boss theme, especially from Phase 2, has become one of, if not my single favorite boss theme in the entirety of the Final Fantasy franchise, which is no small feat, let me tell you. While some might say that voice acting deserves to be lumped in with the characters, I'm still just gonna throw it in here because I don't have that much to say about it, and none of it is connected to any kind of character analysis. To be blunt, I liked the voices for the most part. The thing I didn't like was the mindset of everyone's casting, where they purposefully didn't recast the veteran actors to somehow differentiate this game from the original, but the original didn't have voice acting, so I don't know. I just hate that mindset, especially when it's taken to its logical extreme here, where literally everybody was changed. Oftentimes, the change was at worst a sidestep, such as with Cloud and Tifa, and some were even improvements, such as with Barret, Red 13, and Aerith. However, I cannot agree with the recasting of both Sephiroth and Zack Fair, who, yes, does appear in this game. I have actually read a positive review of the new voice for Zack saying, and I'm paraphrasing here, "I think the voice was good, but the line deliveries were just bad." To which I have to say, well, guy, that's what's called not liking the new voice, and to that, I would have to agree. Rick Gomez was absolutely perfect as the voice for Zack. His delivery of the speech at the end of Crisis Core as he faces down an army of Shinra soldiers is wonderfully somber yet resolute. He's a man who knows he's probably about to die, but still faces it with, well, honor.
Boy, oh boy. The price of freedom is steep. Embrace your dreams. And whatever happens, protect your honor. As soldier! Come and get it!
The new guy sounds like a little kid who's trying to sound tough. It just doesn't work for me.
Boy, oh boy. The price of freedom is steep. Embrace your dreams. And whatever happens, protect your honor. As a soldier! Come and get it!
And on Sephiroth, while the new voice for Cloud, Cody Christian, is obviously doing an impression of Steve Burton, albeit with a lighter tone, I think it works for him. However, when the new Sephiroth voice, Tyler Hoechlin, is doing his George Newbern impression, I just don't buy it. He just sounds like he's doing an impression.
It was the crowning moment of our time together. But that was then, and this is now. I have a favor to ask.
As well, and I understand that Aerith's new voice, Brianna White, is an amateur voice actor at the moment, some of her line deliveries were, bad.
Mog wanted to bring happiness to all the Moogles of the forest, so he decided to open a shop of wonders.
As well, it felt like some scenes were calling for a lower-pitched, somber tone, while Brianna just kept doing her flower girl routine, and it was kind of distracting, irrelative of my personal feelings toward the character, which we'll get into later.
Make it right!
Finally, and this can go into several sections, I want to point out that at various points, you control each of the party members outside of combat. However, even if a different character is set as the active party leader, you can only control Cloud in the overworld when he's in the party. Why? Why have this awkward freeze-frame camera movement at the beginning of every battle? It looks awful, and it feels even worse. But overall, even despite the crappy textures and shaky voice acting, the presentation might be the game's greatest strength. While the characters are good, as we'll get into soon, and the gameplay can be good when it works correctly, only the music and the models, which I didn't even go into, really hold up, and they're some of the highest highs the series has ever had. The story and characters. As anyone who has seen that first video can attest, I do not like the story of Final Fantasy VII, and not just the remake either. Each character has essentially the same backstory. That in the past, Shinra screwed them over, and now they're fighting against them as part of the main group, where that murder boner then extends to Sephiroth for the similar threat he poses to the planet. Cid, Barret, Tifa, Yuffie, Vincent, Red 13, Aerith, they're all a part of this. The sole exception is Cloud, who was Shinra, just not in the way that he originally thought. Because of this, the awful graphics and models, and the general pace of the story only allowing the bare minimum of text boxes, I found the characters really boring, and the plot itself was likewise full of contrivances. The example I used in that first video was when the buggy happened to break down in the exact place to allow you to learn about Red 13's backstory at Cosmo Canyon. The general flow of the game tended to be someone would propose an idea, and then the other characters would just go along with it, even if it's weird or stupid, like dressing Cloud as a woman and sneaking into Don Corneo's mansion. They were all just so agreeable, even someone who really probably shouldn't be that way, like Barrett. All of them were very bland, especially outside of their designated backstory sections, and most of the time they just plainly explained the situation or asked the obvious questions that need to be voiced to continue the story. And if there's one area that needed the most help, it was the characters. Thankfully, this is also the one area of the remake that I felt really paid off. The remake endows each character with a colorful personality, shows them changing and becoming either more sure of themselves or their place in the world, and just generally flesh them out very, very well. Even though we don't know anything about how Barrett came to be fighting Shinra, we do understand what kind of a person he is. He's brash and quick to anger, and tends to act far before he even considers thinking, often requiring Tifa or Cloud to hold him back from starting too much shit. Tifa is also lovable. She was just kind of the generic team mom archetype in the original game, but here she takes much more of a sisterly role. She's the emotional core, with the other 3 party members unable or unwilling to share their emotions most of the time. Meanwhile, Tifa is pretty open about everything, whether that be something relatively banal like her fear of ghosts, though she merely acts this out instead of saying it, expressing her disapproval in bombing the reactors, playfully teasing Cloud as she fixes him a drink, or exclaiming her bloodlust at the prospect of running water.
Would kill for a shower.
Cloud definitely takes after his post-Final Fantasy VII persona, if you catch my drift. In the original, he had a bit more of a devil-may-care attitude towards most things, whereas in all of the peripherals and guest appearances, he was characterized as some dour misanthrope who would rather be off brooding than anything. This is much closer to that, but is tempered with a good amount of awkward concern for his friends that he doesn't quite know how to express. Overall, I feel that this is the best iteration of Cloud that we've ever gotten from a writing standpoint. However, I do feel that his emotionlessness was taken too far overall. While the dialogue seems to imply that he enjoys fighting at several points, such as when he more or less agreed with Roche at wanting a proper rematch, his expression is most often one note. Even at his most dour, such as in Advent Children, we do still see a small smirk creep onto Cloud's face when the party leaves him to duel Kadaj alone in the final battle. Even in Kingdom Hearts, when he gets like no characterization outside of must kill Sephiroth, he does banter around with Leon and smile as they both charge sword first into Heartless. I'm okay with him not being sure how to express his emotions on a conscious level, but even people like that tend to do so unconsciously during moments of stress or adrenaline. So I felt that a little bit more of that would have made an already good character even better. The weak link here is unfortunately Aerith. Not only did she have the worst voice of the main 4, but as I said in the previous video, she was so obviously a quirky girl. This trope is common in a lot of romance anime especially, where you have this down-on-his-luck guy or girl, and then suddenly this new person enters their life and they're just so different and strange and alluring. They constantly smile and they're super passionate about what they do, and they somehow always worm their way into the main character's heart for one reason or another. But alas, it's all a facade. It's been a bunch of Stepford smiles, and they're secretly hiding away some plot-critical detail, or they're covering up their dark past. In other words, Aerith is the cherry blossom girl, common in Japanese media, which this is by the way. Hey, she even has death and fate as regular themes to her character, and she's associated with flowers. Done deal. In all seriousness though, I personally found the game's attempts to unpurify her hollow. While many would argue that she was like that in the original, I would say that she sucked in the original either way. Even if she was though, it's a fact that this game made it an explicit point to show that Aerith isn't the demure flower girl we've come to know through peripherals and guest appearances. She curses, she gets mad, she goes all John Cena on Corneo's men, you know, the whole shebang. It just all seemed desperate to me, and I'm so sick of that archetype of the person who's so overtly nice just to hide something. In most stories, it at least makes sense in that depending on their backstory, the other characters would probably call them crazy or distance themselves from those characters and then move on with their lives. Or maybe their past or fate is just too painful to say. But with Aerith, the other characters see whispers too. They know some freaky shit is going on, and if Aerith explained what happened to her and her mother, I'm sure Barrett would say, wouldn't put it past those Shinra bastards, and agree with her wholeheartedly. Tifa is also generally agreeable in this version, and Cloud seems to go along with all her plans anyway too, so I just really don't like Aerith. I don't like her voice, though I'll admit it's the best one we've gotten because her other ones were bad.
See? You don't look so sure. Well, okay, I understand. Go, get things settled.
Huh?
No matter how far away you are, once you find your light, I'm sure it will lead you back here again. Right?
I suppose.
So I'll stay here. And I'll cheer for you. Okay, Cloud?
Okay.
I don't like her personality. I don't like the amount of times the game slows you down to do the whole, hey, Aerith isn't like the other girls kind of thing. And she doesn't even really work from a gameplay perspective, though I'll get into that much later. To talk about the supporting characters, I would say that they're also very good. All of the NPCs feel like believable humans, even though they're far from fleshed out, and some are even endearing, such as the Angel of the Slums with her Robin Hood-esque antics. There's also the 3 background Avalanche members, one of which I liked. Biggs was a total bro. He had kind of a Charlie Sheen look about him, which docks him some points, but he comes across as the only tolerable one of the 3 to me. He just does his job. He and Cloud have something of compatible dispositions, at least Cloud seems to tolerate Biggs the most, and he had that extra little zing of being revealed as the original owner/teacher of the orphanage in Sector 5. Wedge is...
I'll head home on my own. After all, I'm only a little sore.
I mean, look, on paper, he's fine. He's a big, fat, lovable idiot who's just trying his best to do what's right. But god damn it, I hate his voice. And I hate it because it's so clearly a voice. The guy can't emote using it. He always has the same tone no matter what line he goes for. And it ruined every dramatic scene he was a part of.
We're supposed to get to Wall Market.
You have to open the gate!
You need to step away
if
from
you don't
the
let
gate.
these people through!
Back off! It's not gonna happen.
Wedge!
I'm no good. Not to anyone up there or down here.
It almost feels like they cast this guy based only on Wedge's role in the original, where he had like 3 lines, but he had to do a lot more since he was the only Avalanche member to survive. Oh, wait. So before I get to Jesse, both Biggs and Wedge survive the plate falling. It's never explained how they do. Wedge falls from like 60 feet and then who knows how far down into that secret research facility, and Biggs has not only the plate, but the tower itself fall on him. But hey, they're alive. Isn't that cool? Doesn't that set a great precedent for characters that are supposed to die in this here story? Huh? Isn't that wonderful? Yeah, if you couldn't tell, I am vehemently opposed to this narrative decision. These 3's entire purpose in the story was to die. That's the point of their existence. They had fun, quirky personalities in the original game to endear you to them, and then they die, and then you get really pissed off at Shinra. It's a classic storytelling trope. Them living in any capacity, and no matter for how long, ruins that, especially since they proceed to accomplish exactly nothing in the plot. Wedge pretends to have a point by delivering the message that the larger branch of Avalanche was coming to extract the party after they rescue Aerith, but that message could have easily been relayed by the mayor, who was in the same room and was Avalanche's inside man within Shinra. How did Wedge get topside anyway? Never mind. And then he gets thrown out the window. You know, good job, Wedge. You are useless. Biggs doesn't even get the token effort though. He's just somehow in a bed in like a coma or something during the ending. No explanation, just a cheap, hey, he lived relief moment. But back to Jessie, she's a thought, and I mean that literally. It's implied that she's had a lot of, sexual relations in the past, and Wedge even says that all of her flirting and such is just a game. I mean, she is an actor after all. It could just be how she gets her kicks. Or it could be that she's just forwardly flirtatious with people as she gets to know them, especially those she becomes endeared or attracted to. It's a tight line between having characters have opinions about others, like Wedge about Jessie, and everything you hear be taken as fact. In games especially, writers generally don't add superfluous lines of dialogue. They usually only tell the player the bare minimum to make the story function, which is one of the industry's main problems, by the way, to facilitate getting back to gameplay as fast as possible. That, or they have some random NPC be like, well, I heard that President Shinra was having an affair with his cousin Palmer. You know, that type of deal. And there isn't a cutscene and the character doesn't have a name or anything. Basically, if a named character says something, then more often than not, the writer included the line to be taken as fact for the reason I specified above. Thinking of it this way, what Wedge says here is fact. Jessie is something of a whore. Okay, fine, she's already a terrorist, so I guess that's not really any worse. But if she is that, then the game does whatever it possibly can to absolve her of any ill will that personality defect might accrue. She has a loving family, a tragic backstory involving her father. She expresses endless guilt about the bombings right up until her death. The works. So, which is it? As well, I'm never really a fan of those overly forward characters. Confident and playful, sure. That's what Dorothea was in Three Houses, or what Black Widow plays at in some MCU movies like Winter Soldier. But acting like a total thought? Come on, get some dignity, would you? However, even Jessie isn't the worst character. The worst character is Shinra, or characters, I guess, if we're counting the whole company, which I am. It's just Shinra as a whole. Now, they were bad in the original game. They were so laughably evil that it was hilarious. Well, that was kicked up to a 11 in the remake. And it's so much worse now when these creatures act in an even more exaggeratedly evil way with such lifelike models. Scarlet keeps a literal pet Shinra soldier that walks around on all fours. Heidegger has the stupidest laugh animation. Like, seriously, who laughs like that? Palmer is absolutely ridiculous. Hojo is... yeah. President Shinra is the worst, though. He's so evil, it's so funny. There is no humanity in him in all of the wrong ways. He's just that awful, stereotypical businessman who is literally all about the bottom line. Never mind that most of those types at least care about a wife and or kids. Shinra doesn't. They're just... they're just so funny and so awful. They're also really, really stupid. Scarlet doesn't even try and hide her true nature when the press is interviewing her, for one. Hojo just lets the party go into the final battles when he could easily just lock them in that testing floor until the regular army arrives and kills them, and they could do literally nothing to stop it. Like, he trapped them there to do his test things anyway. He could just keep them there, right? Palmer is Palmer. And of course, there's the infamous thing about
that dropping an entire section of the city on top of another section of the city to kill, from what I'm being told, 5 people, okay, is not only financially irresponsible, but our PR will take a noticeable hit.
Well, you see, Reeve, we live in a world of absolutes.
Yes, we do. As in, this is an absolutely terrible plan. Okay, I'll use a metaphor. It's like you're trying to make an omelet by dropping an entire section of the city on top of another section of the city. I'll be honest, this sounds like something Heidegger yelled out in a meeting and no one challenged him on it.
And even besides the higher-ups, the Shinra personnel are somehow incapable of putting 2 and 2 together about the appearance of Avalanche. The game makes it a point to say that Shinra has eyes on them through various cameras as they infiltrate the reactors both times they try to do it, but no one recognizes a blonde guy with a giant sword, a man with a gun for an arm, or a woman dressed like that. No one. Not a single soldier. Really? Okay. I suppose it could be taken as parody, but given that it's played so seriously, I highly doubt that. Like, wouldn't it have been more logical to just send the regular army into Sector 7 slums and enact martial law to weed out Avalanche? At that point, they can't fight back or they'll expose themselves. They could relocate, maybe, but if security is tight enough, then that should be at least very difficult to do, and hopefully impossible to do quietly. Again, it's not like Avalanche is being particularly subtle about the whole thing. And no, just because the mayor lampshades that he's the one fixing all of Avalanche's security screw-ups, it doesn't make it any better. To talk about the plot would be almost pointless. This is one of the most overanalyzed games in existence, and a lot has been said about it already. I've even said in the past that the section that the remake adapts, roughly the first eighth of the game, is probably the best part in terms of pacing. There's rarely a dull moment in this section, at least in the original game, from the double Mako reactor bombing missions, to rescuing Tifa from Don Corneo, to the fall of the plate, to rescuing Aerith. But I mean, what I just laid out there is all that there is. The major flaw with this section of the game is that it leaves next to no room for character development. Every character is given their baseline personalities, and then action happens. For the original game, which has the whole rest of it to flesh out the cast, this was completely fine, and if anything, it added to the replayability by thrusting you right into the action for about 4 hours before finally slowing you down for world building later on. But this did present a problem for the remake. How do you flesh out this section into a full game? So little actually happens in terms of character, and there are like 6 sequences. Reactor 1, Reactor 2, Aerith section, Don Corneo, Sewers and Chainyard section, the plate falling, and then rescuing Aerith. How could they possibly do it? The answer, unfortunately, is tons and tons of filler, but we'll get into that in the progression section. For now, irrelative of the mountainous pacing issues that arise from so much filler, I'll say that it benefits the characters. While I personally have my doubts that the characters will hold up over multiple games, I'll say that most of them hold up for this one at least. There are plenty of small moments to choose from Cloud being super possessive about the Buster Sword when Biggs offers to modify it for him, to Cloud's flustered response to when Tifa sees him in a dress, to Tifa and Aerith both latching onto Cloud in the haunted train yard for protection, to Barrett taking the time to clear his throat before his speech to who he believes is all of Midgar. I've said it many times, but it's often in these smaller moments, rather than big overarching storylines, that we get a sense of who these people are. My personal favorite is when the party is about to jump off of the train at the beginning of the second bombing mission. Tifa is terrified of doing so, but they don't have much time before Shinra catches them, so Cloud grabs her and helps her make the jump, before clutching her tightly and taking the brunt of the damage for her sake. This moment perfectly encapsulates their relationship of utter devotion and, despite Cloud being immensely awkward, the care he has for her and the gratitude Tifa has for having him around. But alas, not all of it is good. Barrett's attitude towards Cloud pulls a complete 180 as soon as the second bombing mission starts. Before, he was yelling, he was insulting, and was giving all of these rude backhand comments about Cloud being a dog for Shinra, but once the second mission starts, he's cracking jokes and trying to get Cloud to banter with him. It's really weird and only half-heartedly justified in that Cloud reluctantly agreed to come after Jessie was injured. As well, and I'll get into this in a bit more detail in the progression section, I don't think I can overstate how much of a pace killer chapters 8 and 9 are. I'm not saying that we need to have action all of the time, but meeting Aerith, going through that rooftop section, fighting really weak enemies for an hour, and then slogging through crane puzzles, and then doing so many side quests with Johnny, who I hate with every fiber of my being, is absolutely inexcusable. Now, I like Wall Market for all of its faults. The rooftop banter is charming on a first run, and S65 Road is one of my favorite tracks in the game, but on repeat playthroughs, going through this section is boring at best and actively painful at worst. Whose idea was it to include crappy crane puzzles? Seriously. And I suppose I might as well throw this in here just to introduce it. Sephiroth is introduced an hour into the game. I have read arguments in favor of this, and I couldn't disagree more with them. The most prominent one I've heard goes something along the lines of, well, they couldn't do what they did in the original game because everyone already knows what happens in the original game, or some variation on that. This is quite possibly the stupidest thing I think I've ever heard. So if they remade Lord of the Rings, could they not do Gollum the same way? You know, with the inner turmoil and the sympathy and all that? Or maybe they'll make it so he actually overcomes the ring's influence in the end this time? Well, they obviously can't just do that thing that worked in the past. It would be too predictable. Seriously, anyone who actually genuinely believes that any storytelling trope is somehow obsolete is a idiot. Even the so-called problematic ones, like people who are racist, can be reworked and used again and again in new environments, no matter your bias toward or against the trope in question, so don't even try and give me that bullshit. Sorry, that's the one thing I get heated about consistently. Some context for Sephiroth, not my trope argument. In the original game, funnily enough, the actual Sephiroth, as in physical, actually there person, only appears in flashbacks or in the final boss fight. All of his other appearances were through different avatars. Now, this came with its own problems, but one thing the game did absolutely right was holding off on him until the perfect moment. Sephiroth's first act in the game, in terms of he was actually where the party was in some form and did something that they noticed, was when he killed President Shinra at the tail end of the Aerith rescue mission. It was a declaration. Up until this point, this old geezer of a businessman was our main antagonist, but right here, the game made it clear that that wasn't the case anymore. It was held off just long enough, teased just enough for it to be maximally effective. It worked, and I believe it would have worked again for the remake. And to be clear, Sephiroth was name-dropped at several points before this, so it was introduced that he might be a player in the story, such as during the Cloud and Tifa flashback to Nibelheim, where Cloud proclaims his intention to become a soldier to be like Sephiroth. But here, I mean, this is directly after bombing the first reactor. It's Chapter 2, an hour into the game, and here he is, in full view, in all of his glory, taunting Cloud like the devil on his shoulder. I really don't get this decision, other than as complete fan service, which I don't agree with the inclusion of. And then, of course, we have the ending, which, well, the Whispers. Yeah, that's right, the Dementors get their own section. The Whispers are far and away the worst thing about the game. Story-wise, gameplay-wise, aesthetically, mechanically, anything. They single-handedly bring the game down from a 5 out of 10 to a 3 out of 10. So, basic storytelling lesson. Among many other ways of thinking, such as based around a world or around themes, you could consider developing a story based around the characters, so you have characters that you think up, and the creation of the story is playing with, giving arcs to, and shuffling around these characters where those acts form the story. Or you can center it around plot, so you think of events that happen and weave characters and connections into them, hopefully naturally. Final Fantasy VII Remake, as a remake, does this. The original game is there. You have all of the story mapped out 20 years in advance, but I mean, the problem is that they made too many changes to the characterization and their attitudes and values to keep the story the same. What's the solution to that problem, especially considering the characters are all around a vast improvement? Well, there are again 2 broad answers. Change the characters to more closely follow their actions from the original game, or change the story to form a more natural tale around these newly enhanced characters. What you don't do is add a Deus Ex Machina that lets the characters be different and the plot the same, with a handwave of destiny and preserving the will of the planet. The Whispers are explained like an hour before the end of the game as arbiters of fate, to serve as a way for the developers to make changes to characterization without impacting the overall story. So this new Cloud and Barret aren't keen on working with each other after the initial mission, but the Whispers injure Jessie, forcing Cloud to take her place in the second bombing mission. I'll go into more examples momentarily, but in a broad sense, the Whispers only really serve 2 purposes: to give the game a climax, and to take away the character's agency. Oh, well, Cloud doesn't want to do the second bombing mission? Tough luck, fate has decreed it so. Oh, Cloud is in the perfect position to just kill Reno? Too bad, the Whispers cock-blocked him. It really sucks out the narrative tension of the scene when you realize this, by the way, as any event that would normally serve as a threat is quickly rendered null because you know the Whispers would just magic everything back to normal, and that's the worst part, really. I honestly have no idea what they were thinking with this, as it's just so wrong on every conceivable level. So for fun, let's go into all of the major ways that they keep everything the same, shall we? 1. It can be inferred that the Whispers are responsible for Aerith staying in the streets to meet Cloud after the first bombing mission, when logically she would be running away like everyone else. 2. The day that Avalanche is set to go bomb another reactor, the Whispers attack them and injure Jessie, forcing Barret to hire Cloud to go instead. 3. They prevent Cloud from killing Reno, and then ensure that both Cloud and Aerith escape the church, such as by blocking off the troops from getting to Aerith, and saving Aerith when she starts to fall due to a faulty railing. 4. They're implied to have caused the deaths of Wedge, Biggs, and Jessie, as they're seen around them before it happens and during the latter two's death scenes. Or quote-unquote death scenes. 5. They stop the party from preventing the fall of the Sector 7 plate. Like, they definitely would have stopped it if the Whispers didn't intervene. Yes, I'm serious. 6. When Cloud begins to remember more of his past in the secret research facility, they push him and the others out and break his concentration. 7. When Hojo is about to spill the beans on Cloud's actual past, he's carried away by the Whispers before he can do so. 8. When Wedge, who survived his previous fall, attempts to help Barret and Aerith against the big robot called the Arsenal during their escape, the Whispers hold him back and are implied to throw him out of a window to his death. 9. They protect Cloud and the others as they escape on the highway from falling debris and an explosion. 10. Most egregiously, they bring Barret back from the dead after Sephiroth kills him. 11. And then, of course, we have the ending, which doesn't make any damn sense. So the game needed an ending. It needed some climactic way to finish this chapter of the story, or otherwise people would have felt cheated. Well, more cheated for having only gotten an eighth of the story in the first entry. So they have Sephiroth appear, make a portal to another world, and in it, the party fights a god. Like, what else is this thing supposed to be? I mean, it looks a little bit like the weapons from later in the game, but come on. I really wish I didn't have to explain this because it just seems so obvious to me, but did the writers not realize that they had to continue the story from here? Like, we're fighting a manifestation of fate itself. What comes next? Time? The planet itself? In the original game, immediately after they escape Midgar, the task is to get past a snake monster. Is that going to be a challenge still? I just don't understand. Do I just have too small an ambition? Am I wrong to think that the scale of the original game was fine? That we didn't need to go any bigger with it? We were stopping a guy that wanted to destroy the planet and rebuild it in his image. Okay, we already had that in Final Fantasy VI, but fine, it's cataclysmic. It's something the party would want to stop. We don't need this fate shit. Why does Nomura keep putting this garbage in his games? And, I mean, it's not like it can't be done well if he really wants to tell these kinds of stories and ask these kinds of questions. The Stormlight Archive, for example, has some pretty interesting commentary on Destiny, as the shards seem to know about it and make plans for the futures where they won't be present, like Honor sending down our messages for after he dies, spoilers, and Odium's perfect planning being thwarted by Dalinar at the end of Book 3, telling us that no matter what Odium says, the future isn't set in stone. As well, Kung Fu Panda has a good take on it. Again, that it's not set in stone and that the future doesn't make you, but rather it's what you make of it. I mean, Your Name, Adjustment Bureau, Serendipity, T2 Judgment Day, Until Dawn. There are tons and tons of examples of stories that ask these questions effectively, but Final Fantasy VII was not the one to do it. It's a game about eco-terrorism and environmentalism that doesn't exactly scream change the fabric of time itself to me. Most of the problem is on a conceptual level. Yes, the story was there and mistakes were made, we've already gone over that. But the execution was equally awful, and I don't think it's an understatement to say that it was probably the worst handled aspect of the entire game. Even setting aside that I don't like that they damage the rest of the narrative, they have problems. For one, Sephiroth controls them. Yes, Sephiroth, the one trying to specifically defy destiny, can control the whispers that are meant to preserve destiny? Need proof? Okay, what's he doing here in the final battle? Argument. He can only do that because you already killed the Whisper God. Rebuttal. Why do the Whispers still exist at all at this point if killing the Whisper God destroys the Whispers across all of time and space, as we saw when Zack survived when he was supposed to have died? Conclusion. The Whispers don't make any sense. As well, as with all entities that exist across all of time, we get into the trouble of paradoxes. Cloud and company killed the Whispers in their time, which made it so Zack survived in the past, which makes it so events wouldn't play out the same, which makes it so Cloud and company can't eventually kill the Whisper God in their time, etc., etc. For fun, I thought of a workaround for this problem, and came up with a way to both better integrate the Whispers, offer an explanation for them that wasn't in the final tenth of the game, and give the characters their agency back all at once. Make the Whisper God a character. It's really that simple. My proposal is that the Whispers, like the planet, spoke to the Cetra, and the reason Aerith was so freaked out by the Whispers at the beginning of the game was because the Whisper God, we'll call him Pudding, was yelling at her inside of her head or something. Then, when Aerith touches Cloud, Pudding could be accidentally ejected from her somehow, maybe by Aerith's will, or maybe not, it doesn't really matter. But then, Pudding could be there to talk to Cloud, explain what's happening, and provide a voice for the Whispers. When Cloud and Tifa are attacked by the Whispers before the second bombing mission, Pudding could be exclaiming how Cloud must go on that mission and remind Cloud that if he didn't go, that his friends would be hurt or killed, especially after Jessie isn't able to go. When you fight Reno and Rude and try and stop the Sector 7 plate from falling, Pudding could somehow enhance the two and make it so they're strong enough on their own to drop the plate before the party can stop it. And we can even go one step further with this idea. I think an interesting twist is that the planet elects a powerful entity to take up the role of the Whisper God, and Pudding might turn out to be Jenova herself, Jenova being the mother of Sephiroth. This would not only make us question how much of Pudding's actions are Jenova and how much of them are the planet's will incarnate, but it would also explain how Sephiroth would be able to control them after Pudding's death, as he was the biological son of Jenova and would more or less exert his will over them using that. It could also happen alongside or maybe even replacing Cloud's visions of Zack, assuming that we're in a time loop where Zack survived, became Stamp, and left Cloud with the Buster Sword, setting everything into motion like it happens. In that version of events, Cloud wouldn't have any reason to have those random Zack mutterings. The point is that it would go from the will of the planet taking away the character's agency to an actual character exerting their will over others, which happens all the time and is completely fine. Like, a boss exerts their will over their employees by giving them jobs, you know? But alas, we do not have that. Any of that. Instead, we have a shitty Deus Ex Machina where none of the characters have any agency, and the Word of God trope is quite literal in universe. It's awful. And that's not even talking about Sephiroth's part in all this. He, along with Aerith, is implied to have seen the future to at least some extent, and so he knows that he's ultimately going to lose, so he's doing whatever he can to change destiny. But if that's the case, why is he fighting you at the end? You just killed Destiny. You killed Pudding. The future is now unwritten. He won. He doesn't have to fight you. Oh, wait. It's a Final Fantasy VII game, so we have to have a Sephiroth boss fight, right? Okay, so is every entry in this remake series going to have Sephiroth as the final boss? Won't that get old? The whispers just add to the massive pacing problem that this game has. Speaking of which, progression. As with many negative aspects of this game, I find the pacing of the story to be difficult to talk about without coming across as condescending. I'm well aware that people wear their nostalgia goggles, and I'm also well apprised to the fact that many people unequivocally enjoy this game in its entirety, even aside from those rose-tinted glasses. But I would have to ask those people, have you played it more than once? On a first playthrough, this game's story and pacing are absolutely immaculate, but the problems arise when you play through it again. If you're like me, you like to get to the good stuff on a repeat playthrough. You thought back to the game, you remembered those awesome moments, and conveniently forgot about all of the walking that you had to do to get to them. You play Monster Hunter, and you love it, and you conveniently forgot that there's a lot of busy work, research gathering, and menuing involved to keep up with your supplies. You play Fire Emblem Three Houses, and the strategy and the characters are great, but man, you don't remember how long those monastery sections take sometimes. Oh, you play Mario 64. Geez, that game is great! Revolutionized 3D platforming, but we conveniently forgot about the everything that really sucked about that game. Like the slippery controls, and the bad camera, and the boring levels. The point is, it's human nature to only remember the good stuff. That's why when people say, oh, this era of games was the best, you have so many great titles, they only proceed to list those titles, and then they get mad when you mention the mountains of crap that came out then too, you feel me? Back on topic, Final Fantasy VII Remake has a lot of pacing problems, both on the micro and macro scale. In terms of the story being told in this game, there are those 6 core sequences. Reactor 1, Reactor 2, Aerith, Don Corneo, Plate Falling, Rescue Aerith. That's all you need to tell the story, and that's all the original game gave us. With the remake, not only was everything lengthened considerably, but they added more content in between those core story sections, sometimes without taking into consideration the issues that would arise from doing so. To start, there are 3 big areas where side quests are emphasized. First is in Chapter 3, when Tifa is showing Cloud around the Sector 7 slums, and Cloud begins his work as a mercenary. This is really the only one that feels justified, as there is a definite break in the narrative between the day they blow up the first reactor and the day they blow up the second. There's space there to be filled with content, and they do that with both these side quests and another section I'll talk about briefly as we go through the game chronologically. The second part is in Chapter 8, when you first meet Aerith and she shows you around the Sector 5 slums. This doesn't quite fit as nicely. This takes place immediately after the botched attempt at blowing up that second reactor, where the party is ambushed and trapped by Shinra and are framed for being Wutai spies. In reality, Cloud would be extremely eager to get back to Sector 7 and ensure at least Tifa's safety. Instead, he's playing a kid's game, literally. The final part is in Chapter 14, which is after the Sector 7 plate falls, but before the party goes topside to rescue Aerith. And I think that this section speaks for itself. Aerith has been captured and in all likelihood is being tortured for information about the Promised Land, but hey, let's spend an indeterminate amount of time helping the people of the slums, shall we? Are you starting to understand where I'm coming from a bit? Like, this story, as it is told in both the original and in the remake, doesn't leave a lot of room for breaks. It's a pretty breakneck tale with a lot of urgency and tension. For the original, that worked. This was the first eighth, and it was all an extended set piece to entice the player into becoming engrossed in the world before letting them out into the larger overworld and the rest of the game. It was purposeful in its approach, even if I myself have some problems with it. For the remake, that wasn't going to fly. Unless they made all of the side quests mandatory, which I want to make clear would not have been a good idea, then they couldn't exactly keep the developer's promise of properly fleshing out Midgar from the bare-bones presentation we got in the original game, which they have said was at least part of their intention with the remake. The only way they could have done it is to more intricately weave everything together and shoehorn in reasons to travel to other places within the city, which would have involved more asset creation, more delays, and more filler anyway. Judging from the game's many problems as it is, from awful textures to laughable tension dips, I dare say that this is the best they could have done. They padded out the story beyond what was needed, provided random and often pace-breaking stops to the narrative at play to give way for side quests intended to help flesh out the world, and it was really their only solution to fulfill their promises even a little bit. Man, it's almost sounding like this whole episodic remake business was a bad idea or something. And guys, that's just the macro scale stuff. To talk about the micro, I would have to take literally like a year. In general, there are near constant slowdowns. It is absolutely infuriating to be going through one of the levels like the subway or the sewers and then be artificially slowed down from your sprint so the characters can banter or point out something obvious. It happens so often. Other times, Cloud is forced to be in the back of a group as it travels, so instead of raising the NPC's top speeds or equalizing it to some degree, the game forces Cloud to awkwardly jut in and out of his sprint animation because he jogs too slowly to keep up, but sprints too quickly. And of course, this wouldn't be a modern PlayStation title if it didn't have long sequences of slowly walking from one place to another for story to happen, when it could have easily been a cutscene and I could have put down the controller and made notes or gotten a drink or something. Almost the entirety of the Aerith rooftop section, walking with Tifa to the apartments for the first time, walking with the thugs to that back alley so Cloud can kill them, the entire Shinra presentation, waiting and waiting for Aerith to be done talking to people on the way to her house for the first time. I understand that modern developers mostly develop for the first playthrough, but I don't agree with the notion that that's a good thing. We should be rewarding them for making a game that can be enjoyed many times, a game that doesn't have these unnecessary slowdowns that have very, very easy solutions. And even apart from that, there's just huge problems with the way the game frames every encounter. If you looked at each scene and compared the intensity of direction to each other, you wouldn't be able to find a difference between Chapter 1 and Chapter 11. One is the bombing of a reactor, a plot-critical encounter. The other is a spooky ghost. In the sewers, an immense amount of visual weight is given to the act of crossing a small body of water and escaping like 4 Sahagins, of which you've killed a dozen by then. Just look at what they do with Roche. Who even is Roche? Some nobody soldier who's good at riding bikes. Why do they emphasize everything about him so much when other, more plot-relevant things like the Airbuster or Hojo's experiments are given hardly any fanfare upon seeing them? This ties into my general complaint that the game thinks way too highly of itself. It thinks it's the shit when in many ways it's kinda just shit, you know? As we transition into gameplay progression, I want to briefly touch on the side quests. There are 26 in total, though only 24 are completable in a single playthrough, as 2 in Chapter 9 overwrite 2 others, as they determine which dress Cloud and Aerith get for the auditions. I don't think it's that controversial to say that the side quests aren't that good in this game. I recently played through Xenoblade Chronicles for the first time, and those side quests are the most trite fetch questy bullshit I've ever experienced, but even that game made me care more about the people I was butlering than the remake did. For one, that world is much more interesting than Midgar, but a larger problem with the contexts for them is that they're all the same. It's not like you're some adventuring party rocking into town and helping people for the sake of it. You're a mercenary, and he's a businessman. Every encounter is framed the same way. Cloud is annoyed at having to talk to people. They'll present a problem to him. Cloud will be that asshole who's like, I'll do it for the right price. And then you do it and barely get rewarded anyway. I'll get into the lackluster rewards momentarily, but for now I want to point out that the formula is used constantly, and it's rarely ever played with. My favorite quest in the game is the one where you go get the kids from around the Sector 5 slums in Chapter 8, and then they exclaim that a monster called the Toad King is wreaking havoc just outside of town, and they beg Cloud to stop it. At first, Cloud is the same hard-ass as before, but then he says,
I'll do it for 3 gil. I'm offering a special discount right now on Toad King jobs. Looks like it's your lucky day.
This is a really good bit of character for him, and that kind of confidence and playing with the usual formula is something I would have enjoyed much more of. As it is, the only thing that could keep you engaged with these quests are the individual stories being told, but they're largely terrible. Go solve a rat problem. Go find 3 cats. Go to this factory and kill a monster. Go to this factory and kill a monster. Oh wait, did I repeat myself? Go here, kill this thing. Go here, kill this thing. Go here, kill this thing. The quest givers are too bland to support this type of gameplay loop, and most of the monsters you fight are just tweaked versions of one you see anyway. One of the more unique ones is this big robot with an invincible metal ball in its hands, but this encounter is shit. Either you have Thunder, which can stagger him, you use weaker magic, which takes forever, or you're screwed. But then that gets into my problem of enemy balance, which we'll get into a bit later. To speak about the rewards would be all but meaningless. I think 3 out of the 26 quests gave something truly worthwhile, but that's because they give weapons, and 2 of those are part of that split path in Chapter 9, and they give the same weapon. All others give either gil, which is so plentiful that I nearly broke 100,000 without trying in a single playthrough, an accessory, of which the bought ones are fine and barely make a difference anyway, materia, the ones you obtain being available for purchase anyway, or consumable items, which are almost entirely useless, so much so that I routinely sold most of mine. The only other worthwhile rewards you get are the manuscripts, which are books that give SP to a character, which is used for weapon upgrading, but those are hardly worth the effort to complete the quest to get them, and they're only from rewards in Chapter 14 anyway. For example, to get one of Barrett's manuscripts in Chapter 14, you have to go back down to the underground facility, travel and fight your way through to a new path, and then fight an entire optional boss, all for 10 measly SP that, at best, will net you some extra stat increases that will hardly matter. I guess the Chocobo quest gives you free fast travel, but gil was already in excess, and by the time you finish that quest, unless you're doing them one at a time and doing it very unoptimally, you'll be mostly done with the Chapter 14 batch anyway, and will barely be fast traveling anymore. I think I used it 2 or 3 times after I finished the quest. Yay, I saved 1,000 gil. As well, for completing the 24 available quests in a playthrough, you'll find an elemental materia right by where the chapter ends. I would point out that the elemental materia is arguably the best in the game besides healing materia, but I would also say that that's not nearly a good enough reward for hours of wasted time. But this leads into a larger problem with the game in that there's just no worthwhile loot. There's no proper incentive for you to explore and take the optional paths. At best, you'll get the appropriate potion strength for where you are in the game, but more often than not, you'll get an inconsequential amount of gil or another more useless consumable. Not to bleed into gameplay analysis, but consumables are absolutely useless. ATB uses are incredibly precious. They're your single most valuable resource in battle, and the entire point of fighting is to build ATB for stronger abilities. So why would you waste a bar using a Maiden's Kiss consumable when you could simply wait for the toad effect to wear off? You know? The only useful consumable items are potions of the appropriate strength and Phoenix Downs. The former is a cost-effective way to heal between encounters, as you get so many of them that you'll never run out, and the latter is useful in a pinch when your designated reviver dies, as you only ever get 1 revival materia unless you buy another, which I didn't. The others are all to cure status, or apply a temporary buff that ultimately doesn't matter in the long run. By the time you might need those buffs, you'll have enough materia slots to just put the corresponding materia onto your character, and from there, there's no difference between casting the buff and using the item, except an inconsequential amount of MP, since most of the time, by the time you need those, you'll be in arena challenges that refill MP between rounds. The only useful pickups you'll find are the weapons and a single summon materia in Chapter 6. The latter doesn't even require any searching, it's all but pointed out to you as you cross the way, and from there, just take the obvious elevator to the mini challenge to get it. The former has its own problem. While I'm generally a fan of designated quote-unquote important chests, I think in this case it does more harm than good. When the rest of the potential loot is so bad and uninteresting, explicitly pointing out the weapon containers with a purple glow just further ruins the exploration aspect, as now you know if a chest is worth getting or not. In terms of the weapons themselves, I actually quite liked them. I'll go into this more when we get into the bulk of the gameplay analysis, but I very much appreciated the attempts to specialize each of the 4 playable characters and give them their own identity, and the different weapons allow further specialization. Unlike the original game, there are a lot more stats that are affected by the weapons, due in large part to the weapon upgrade system. Before I get into that though, I'll point out that each weapon has an associated ability, where you gain proficiency with it as you use it correctly, and when the proficiency reaches 100%, you get that ability on all weapons. I'm pretty neutral about this system and have very little to say about it, honestly. It works. Moving on. The weapon upgrade system was a very welcome bit of customization that I wasn't expecting. While it's annoying that you have to enter a separate holographic menu to do it, and unlike other management-based menus, you can't just use the shoulder buttons to cycle through characters, you have to exit the holographic space, switch characters, and then go back in, the different buffs and options it gives you are welcome, and point to one of the best things Tetsuya Nomura has been putting in his games as of late. Especially for games when changing equipment changes appearance, it sucks to be happy with how you look, have to upgrade, and then have all of the new stuff look like shit. With more recent Nomura titles like Kingdom Hearts 3 and now this, there seems to be a concerted effort to keep everything fairly well balanced. One of the most positive results of this is that I can't actually say that any weapon on any given character is inherently the best. It's much more a matter of playstyle and what you spend your SP on within the weapon upgrade system. If tuned correctly, the Buster Sword, your starting weapon with Cloud, is at least comparably powerful to the Twin Stinger, your last weapon, and many, if not all of the other weapons follow suit. Granted, there are some outliers, notably the Nailbat weapon for Cloud and the 2 melee weapons for Barret. The former is at least unique, though not in a good way, for taking away your heavy combo in Punisher mode for a single powerful swing, which has pitiful range and is overall fairly useless in real combat. The melee Barret weapons problem is that Barret already has a specialty. He's your primary ranged unit. While Aerith is technically your other ranged fighter, she's also magically oriented and is most likely going to double as your healer / black mage if ever you have one. Barret's melee weapons take that specialty away from him, and for what? He's unbearably slow, and he does arguably less damage than with his bullets, as by the time you get your first melee weapon, you're in chapter 14, which is after he gets his maximum fury attack, which finally makes his DPS decent. But aside from those examples, every other weapon is a solid choice depending on your playstyle. My issues with the weapon upgrade system are very few. First, it seems like every weapon has at least one largely useless tree, like increasing attack power by a whopping 5%. These trees usually have 1 or 2 useful upgrades, like a new materia slot or more damage reduction when guarding, but they're mostly useless stat changes. As well, you don't get enough SP to max everything out in a weapon. Even at the max level of 50, yes, I don't know why it stops there either, and completing all of the quests and the arena and VR challenges to get all the manuscripts, you'll still be short. The rest of the manuscripts are locked behind hard mode, which we will get to, I promise, but I think that that's pretty shitty. To talk about materia is a tricky matter, and I'll probably slip into gameplay analysis during it, so sorry about the messiness of this part. So I don't like the materia system in this game. I think it's easily the worst part of the progression of your stats and abilities, and this ties into my problem with how magic and the ATB bar are implemented, but I'll try to keep it separate where I can. Materia was a rare commodity in the original game. I didn't buy any during my run through of the equivalent section, or maybe I bought a Thunder, I think? I don't remember. And I had less than 10 materia total by the end. But again, that was the first eighth of the game. By the end of the adventure, you have a comparable amount to how much you get by the end of this first remake part. However, just because the amount is the same doesn't mean the variety is the same. Materia is split into 5 large categories. Green for spells that you can cast using ATB, blue for link-based materia like Magnify and Elemental, purple for passive bonuses like stat increases or damage reduction or the odd refocus materia, which is completely unique, yellow for physical actions that again use ATB, and red for summon materia, which are only available in boss fights. I found summon materia entirely useless. I was never a fan of the Final Fantasy XIII method of summoning, where they just kind of act as a replacement party member for a time until you enter a separate mode. But at least there, each was tailored to a character's playstyle, and they had the potential for absolutely bonkers damage. In the remake, summons are weak sauce. You summon them, they have the same bad AI as your regular party members, oh, we will get to that, only you have to spend your own ATB bars to use their attacks. And then their big finisher, and this was on New Game Plus, where I could do max damage with some of my attacks, did like 3,000 damage. Great. Thanks for wasting my time. They were so bad that I just didn't bother equipping any on my second playthrough for this video, just because I was so disappointed by their performance. The purple materia is just stat boosts, so I won't bother going over them save for one, Deadly Dodge. Deadly Dodge is straight up the best attack in the game, at least with Cloud and Aerith. With Cloud, it's a double spinning attack that draws enemies toward him for the follow-up hits, does really good damage for being able to do it instantly, and is an AoE, so it has the potential to build ATB insanely fast, in addition to skipping the weak beginning flurry of his combo and getting straight to the two-part finisher. It also acts as a really quick transition from Punisher mode back to Operator mode if you don't want to press triangle. Aerith's Deadly Dodge is just bonkers. She shoots out an energy pellet just like her normal attack, but this one is not only twice as powerful as her regular bullets, but there is also no target limit to it. So if there's one enemy in range, she only shoots one, but if there are 12 targets, she shoots 12 bullets, and each does double what a normal one would do. Again, insano ATB buildup and absolutely bonkers damage. In that situation, Aerith is by far your best DPS character. The only downside with the Deadly Dodge attacks is that they're all close range, even for the ranged fighters of Aerith and Barret, but for the utility, it is invaluable. Yellow materia is very specific, and each individual command has uses in very specific situations. For hard mode, Chakra and Prayer are invaluable, especially Prayer in combination with Deadly Dodge for the ATB buildup, and for first playthroughs, Assess is the same way. ATB Boost is unique in that it's the only command that builds ATB rather than uses it up, and Steal is... I mean, I'll be honest, I found nothing worthwhile to steal in my initial playthrough, so I didn't actually use it on this one. Though I did read while making the script that you can steal a weapon for Aerith from the second train yard boss. Enemy skill is similarly niche and locked behind optional content anyway, so I never used it, though I assume it's just more blue mage shenanigans like it was in the original. Though with only 4 available enemy skills to actually learn, I imagine it's not as fun. Blue materia is once again very specific, though 2 of them are almost universally useful. For one, the elemental materia is fantastic and arguably the best non-deadly dodge materia in the game. If linked with an elemental-based materia like fire on a weapon, it applies part of that elemental damage to your physical hits. In most cases, this is where you're going to want it, as attaching it to your armor only gives you a bit of resistance to that element, which isn't nearly as helpful in almost every situation. If you know what's coming up in most of the encounters, you can tailor your physical element and always have an advantage without having to expend ATB on it, which is a win-win in my book. The other most useful one is Magnify, changed from being the all materia in the original. This turns any material linked to it into an AoE, so casting Fire, if attached to Magnify, will spread out to hit multiple enemies instead of only targeting one. More useful, however, is attaching it to the Cure for multi-target healing. Though you can accomplish this feat almost as well using the Prayer materia, the Magnify materia is much easier to use due to only costing 1 ATB bar per heal, and being able to adjust which level of healing spell to use for any given situation. The only issue with the Magnify materia is that it applies the inherent cut in effectiveness no matter how many targets there are. So at level 1, casting it on 3 targets will only be 40% effective, casting it on 2 targets will only be 40% effective, and on 1 target will also only be 40% effective, rather than the old school method of doing the division and cutting the effectiveness of the spell equally by the number of targets there were, like we saw in Final Fantasy IV. So you had 100% effectiveness against 1 target, half effectiveness against 2, and so on and so forth. The other blue materia are largely useless. I experimented with HP absorption in combination with Deadly Dodge, but I found the difference to be negligible, and the others don't exactly wow me with their effects either. Green materia are your bread and butter spells. Fire, Blizzard, Thunder, the works. In addition to that are stranger ones like Bio, buffs like Hastes, and debuffs like Toad. But as with the items used to heal them, I kind of have to ask why you would ever use the status spells. Not only would you have to either remember which enemies are susceptible to which status, or break the flow of combat to look it up, in which case you might not actually have the necessary status spell equipped anyway, but you could also just use that ATB and MP to just, kill them. If they didn't cost ATB and just MP like in the other games, then I could maybe justify trying them out, but that's just not how this game works. The status spells simply don't fit in with the pace and flow of the remake's combat system, which is largely a cycle of building ATB and then spending it on big attacks. The game rewards timing of spells and big attacks much more than a slower, more methodical approach, and it's for this reason that in addition to status spells, almost all buffs and debuffs are also a waste of time. Fights simply don't last long enough, and the buffs and debuffs don't have enough of an impact to be worth spending a materia slot and MP and ATB bars on. I was actually really excited on my first playthrough to use Haste, as it's traditionally one of my favorite spells to play around with, but it was majorly disappointing, due in no small part to the awful way that ATB is handled in this game, but we'll get to that soon. Speaking of haste, this leads me to my biggest issue with the overall sense of progression of your characters. The materia levels up too slowly. If you equip a fire at the beginning of the game and keep it on a character until the end, there's absolutely no way you aren't going to max it out. Same thing with Cure, Blizzard, Thunder, and all of those standard spells. However, the same cannot be said for things like the HP, MP, and magic ups that you get. I had one on almost constantly, and I think I got it up to level 3 of 5? I don't know, check the footage. Anyway, I know I didn't come anywhere close to maxing it out, and I did every quest, fought every monster I came across, did all of the VR missions available to me, and did all of the arena challenges available to me, and that was as far as I got. For the record, I got the HP up in Chapter 2, basically right before I got the Deadly Dodge, actually. So like an hour into the game, and I spent like 20-ish hours on the game in total. And for a game with barely any post-game content, just New Game Plus, more VR challenges, and individual chapter replays, that's incredibly disappointing. And I'm sure that they knew that this problem existed, as once you load a completed save file, you're informed that you'll get increased experience and AP from then on that file. So they knew that the base amount wasn't going to be enough to max out what you need for some of the super bosses. This lack of AP even translates to some of the later spells, like Haste. The time materia is only available in Chapter 13 through a quest, and a bit later than that through the shop. There is no way that you'll be able to get the stop spell before the end of the game if you don't grind, and I think that's a problem. As well, most of the materia you find lying around are duplicates. While there is a reason to equip duplicate materia on multiple party members, say for the second elemental materia you get for completing all the quests, there is very little reason for, say, another poison materia that you find at Shinra HQ. And besides, if you were really strapped for another copy of Thunder, you would just buy it. Again, Gil is essentially a non-issue, and many of the same problems can be found with all of the different equipment you find throughout the game. In terms of armor, what you can buy is sufficient, and you rarely actually find anything better in the field until you can also buy something better anyway. They're all very basic, with 3 general categories of physically oriented defense, magically oriented defense, and neither with a focus on having lots of materia slots. There are different tiers in each of these 3 categories, but beyond that, the armor slot provides very little excitement. The accessory slot is much the same, only it doesn't have the benefit of having materia slots. The majority of them are fairly inconsequential stat boosts. The most you're looking at is like a 10% strength boost after all. And those that aren't of that variety are usually to prevent status effects, which is pretty useless against the majority of enemies, or it's a unique effect. One that I found interesting was the Crescent Moon Charm, which decreased the damage that the AI party members took. However, outside of particularly large group fights and boss AoE attacks, I found that it was rarely the AI that was targeted for the big attacks. Other than that, there's a soft repeat of the Kupo coin, go look at Bloody Biscuit's take on that for my opinion, and a big steaming goose egg. Again, there's no cool loot in this game. Gameplay. And now we come to the big one. This is the section that we've all been waiting for. To summarize in brief, I think that this combat has astronomical potential for depth and strategy, but as it stands now, it's one of the worst, most unsatisfying JRPG combat systems I've ever had to push through. And no, I'm not exaggerating. I'm going to be breaking this section down into smaller sections: character specializations, combos, ATB, abilities, the stagger system, aggro, enemy AI, partner AI, and bosses in that order. One of my biggest gripes with Final Fantasy VII, and even a game that I really like in Bravely Default, is that every character is the same. Because you can attach any materia to any character in any party configuration, the game made it so everyone was more or less equally competent with every materia, or otherwise was so easy that it didn't matter that one character was better at something than someone else. Some had their advantages and disadvantages, such as Aerith's low defense and Barret being able to hit from range, but for the most part, the party all played very similarly. So, as you can imagine, I found it incredibly refreshing to have each character play completely different, and I promise I'm not saying that facetiously. I really enjoyed how specialized everyone felt, even though I do think that their implementation was flawed in many ways. Cloud is your heavy-hitting melee fighter. He does big damage with his abilities and is reasonably fast to close in on distant targets. Tifa is your hit-and-run character, able to get in, get some hits, and get out very quickly, in addition to having plenty of abilities that keep her on the move. Barret is the tank. While he doesn't do as much damage on average as the other characters, he's supposed to make up for it with his high HP and ability to hit at range, though because of the bad party AI this doesn't always work out. And Aerith is more or less your dedicated mage, shooting magic bullets for her main attack and having the highest magic stat of any character, in addition to having multiple magic-based abilities. And finally, Red 13 is an AI. So that's the biggest disappointment, really. I do understand their reasoning for not allowing him to be a playable character, but when they make him an AI party member with the moveset and limit and everything all there, and they just don't let me use him, it kind of irks me. Comboing in this game is unfortunately probably the third worst thing about the combat. And I want you to know that as I'm writing this, I started by calling it the worst, and then thought of the aggro system, replaced it with second, thought of the AI, and then replaced it with third. So that goes to show just how bad everything else is. Anyway, comboing is extremely unsatisfying in this game, and this ties in with the general feeling of powerlessness you have pretty much throughout the adventure. Basically, you can't really combo things. Setting aside the obvious aerial problem here, enemies don't stagger to your basic hits. Tifa has the longest combo in the game, but you'll rarely ever get to use it unless you cheese the aggro system because they don't stagger. Cloud, similarly, has fairly lengthy combos, and his are a bit worse because he does multiple slashes with a single input. This means that with some attacks, you could input a command, Cloud will start the combo, the AI will not stagger, they will start their attack, and it will go through and hit you out of your combo before the ending of your own input, which again you started before they started their attack, ends. That this is in the game, to any degree, is irredeemable in my opinion. But then, one could argue that the combos are supposed to feel unsatisfying, as that way it incentivizes the player to use the ATB abilities. Well, my retort would be that the game shouldn't sacrifice the fun of one system just to promote another. And as for that ATB system, it has its issues. First and foremost, you can only have 2 ATB bars charged at a time, or 3 if you use the refocus limit, which is largely a waste of time anyway because the limits do so much damage. It's not uncommon at all to have 2 full ATB bars charged, and for you to just kind of be waiting for the correct opportunity to use them. Say a boss is almost staggered, but if you used a bar with Cloud to get it staggered, you then wouldn't have the 2 required for Infinity's End when the boss is vulnerable. Second, everything takes up ATB bars. Except for comboing, blocking, and dodging, any action you take in combat requires the use of an ATB bar. This is a huge problem when it comes to healing, as in conjunction with the awful knockback, lack of hit stun on your attacks, and just generally loose application of damage, you can easily get stuck in a situation of low health and no ATB bars charged. Even items, which I personally think should be the one thing exempt from ATB use, need at least 1 bar, effectively making potions useless in battle, as at that point, you could just use Cure, right? And it's not like you don't get enough healing materia to put it on almost every party member at any given time, so yeah. The point of potions in other games is that it doesn't cost anything other than the potion. It's a cheap, consumable, and often inefficient way to heal a character, but sometimes it's the best option exactly for its cheapness. That all gets thrown out the window when potions run off of the same resource as your magic. Take the original game. Imagine if potions healed for 50 HP and Cure healed for 200, but instead of just using up a potion from your inventory, using a potion took 5 MP and using Cure took 20. enemy. It eliminates the point of it, right? And hey, it's the same concept here in the remake, as MP on normal mode is an effectively infinite resource. You'll use maybe one spell every encounter, ethers are everywhere and are always on sale in shops, and you find rest areas very frequently. So at that point, the only true resource being used that matters is the ATB bar, right? Third, and this is the biggest reason the system just flat out doesn't work, is that only the character you are controlling can effectively build ATB. You do so by blocking or attacking an enemy. Depending on your speed stat, each hit or block builds up a set amount of the ATB bar. The same isn't true for a character controlled by the AI. We'll get to the atrocity of the AI later, but for now, even when the planets align and they do decide to attack, they don't build ATB at all. Just why? What's the purpose of that decision? If it's to make the player constantly switch characters, wouldn't the same thing be accomplished in a much more satisfying way to have characters constantly building ATB as you expend the ATB of another character, so you switch to them, use their ATB, and by the time you're done, another character is full up, so you switch to them, and so on and so forth. It could be a really satisfying chain of events. As it is, I have almost no incentive to switch characters in combat unless I'm fighting a ranged enemy and need Barret or Aerith, or when a character is bound, which is to say stunned. Assuming the planets of a neighboring solar system align and the aggro system is working properly, it's much more efficient to just use Cloud and continually build and spend ATB just with him, or do the same thing with another character, rather than wasting time switching to other characters and starting all over from close to 0 bars. And if the aggro system isn't working properly, then I would probably still stay with Cloud because he's the second fastest at building ATB anyway to heal himself. It's a really, really good thing that most of the abilities are solid, because if they weren't, then this system would be just the worst. As it is, thankfully, using abilities is one of the most satisfying parts of combat. It's the only satisfying part of combat, actually. Every weapon you obtain has an attached ability that you gain permanently for using enough times correctly, which we've already gone over. Since you get a new weapon pretty much every chapter for at least one character, you're never really going to be strapped for combat variety, because each time you get comfortable with a character or start to get bored, they add something new to go on top of the already existing formula, which helped with the game feel immensely. It's the same reason Kingdom Hearts 2's combat was so fun, because you were always getting new combat options. Unfortunately, just as with that game, not all of your options are equally viable, and there are several abilities that have, we'll say, questionable designs. I think the most universal criticism I can level toward the abilities, and even then I can only really do it for like half of them, is that they take too long to execute. Actually, I take that back. The most universal criticism I can lay on them is that there is either very little or no invincibility frames associated with the abilities, which ties into the aforementioned point of them taking too long. Nothing feels worse than when you input a command for an ability and then for your character to immediately be hit out of the animation. True, part of that is the player's fault for not having good enough spatial awareness, but it's also partially the game's fault for being so visually cluttered, which has been a consistent problem with many of Tetsuya Nomura's titles. Not only does this force you to eat raw damage, but it also takes away the ATB you spent on the ability even if it didn't actually go off. With Magic, it's even worse, as you not only lose the ATB, but also the MP you used as well. This should just straight up not be in the game as far as I'm concerned. For a game as visually busy as this one, with so many particle effects and with so much to keep track of already, I can't think of any reasonable excuse for this decision. You have moves that take anywhere between 2 and 5 seconds to execute, where enemies can run up to you and attack in about half a second depending on their variety. That you could be punished for reasons almost entirely out of your control is absolutely unacceptable. Now that said, I will point out that there are some small hits from more fodder-like enemies that don't stagger you out of your abilities, though I don't know if this is character dependent or not. But beside that, any enemy that you would want to spend your ATB on, i.e. the bigger ones, can hit you out of those abilities very easily. And even aside from that critical flaw, some of the abilities are really niche or just plain bad. Does anyone actually use Chi Trap? If it had like a gravity effect of drawing enemies in, that would be one thing, but they can literally just walk through it. Is Braver a necessary ability when focus thrust is faster, has more range, and is almost as good damage-wise, in addition to having the property of building stagger very quickly? The same can be said of Dive Kick and True Strike, which Tifa can basically do anyway with Whirling Uppercut and Omni Strike, albeit with slightly less power and less stagger bonuses, for free. Those aren't even the abilities you use for her maximum damage anyway. If the enemy is staggered, you should probably be using Star Shower into another attack, like another Star Shower or Overpower for its speed. Moving on, most of Barrett's abilities are just entirely useless. What he needed were more abilities to help his lackluster DPS. As we went over with the big rant about status spells, this game doesn't incentivize nor does it reward slow-paced play. Steel Skin and Lifesaver are way too niche. All of his melee attacks are way too slow, and it ends up that the only abilities worth using with him are Focused Shot, Maximum Fury, and very, very briefly at the end of the game, Point Blank. Aerith probably has it the worst though. Most of her abilities play more of a support role, and in a better balanced game, I could see them being very useful. Arcane Ward alone has the potential to straight up double your damage output, or close to double it since the second spell it fires is weirder than the first. But Fleeting Familiar? Useless, as its only purpose is to build ATB, which you have to spend to use it, and she builds ATB faster with Deadly Dodge anyway. ATB Ward? It comes too late in the adventure to be useful, even if it wasn't a less applicable Arcane Ward. Lustrous Shield? Didn't even get the weapon that had it because it was only a stealable item from the second train yard boss. That leaves Sorceress Storm, which is a very useful AoE blast with good power, and Ray of Judgment, which takes absolutely forever to start up, but if it hits, is extremely damaging against any target that gets caught in it. Of course, it falls to the same problem as everything else, where enemies don't stagger and can thus walk through an attack where its entire point is to deal multiple hits in quick succession. In the end, I would say around half of the abilities have consistent use. Most of Cloud's kit is like this, especially Disorder, which is great for DPS, and Focused Thrust, which sees use in every boss battle and every big mob enemy battle. Overpower, Focused Strike, and Star Shower are great tools for Tifa, and Unbridled Strength is a must-have to maximize her damage potential. Getting Maximum Fury is the point where playing as Barrett becomes tolerable, as it finally gives him decent DPS, which you only get the ability in Chapter 13 out of 18, by the way. And though Aerith doesn't really need her abilities all that much, given that her magic and deadly dodge cover her for DPS, Ray of Judgment and Sorceress Storm are fairly useful against at least staggered opponents or groups. Speaking of, this game uses a stagger system a la Final Fantasy XIII, at least that's where I first saw it implemented in the series, though it works more as a combination between that system and the break system of Final Fantasy XV. Basically, enemies have a stagger meter beneath their health bar, and when certain conditions are met, usually just hitting them a bunch, the enemy becomes staggered. This means that they're a sitting duck and take increased damage, usually multiplying attack damage by 1.6? For some reason? I don't know how they came up with that number. But anyway, the stagger system is probably the area that I have the least amount of problems with the combat. It works well and gives you a goal to strive for during some of the tougher battles. Instead of just spamming Braver or Infinity's End, it gives you a reason to use Focused Thrust in order to prioritize long-term strategies in waiting to unleash big attacks for when the enemy is staggered. Of course, I said the least amount of problems. For one, not every enemy staggers in the same way. This would be fine if the methods to do so were obvious, but often it's using a specific element on them, or attacking from behind, or you can only deal stagger damage when they're pressured, which is an entirely separate status inflicted sometimes when you attack, with no metric that you can effectively judge. Great. But anyway, a lot of these alternative methods to staggering enemies are oftentimes too obtuse to be reliable. For two, there's an issue with how ATB is handled in relation to staggering enemies. Now, normal attacks build the stagger meter, but not nearly as effectively as abilities like Focused Thrust or Focused Shot. So, you spend ATB to build stagger, the enemy becomes staggered, and now you're out of ATB to take advantage of it. This is especially a problem for those stretches of game time where you fight alone or with only two people, such as during Chapter 4 with just Cloud, Chapter 13 with just Barrett and Tifa, or Chapters 8 and 9 with just Cloud and Aerith, pre-getting her good abilities. With three characters, you can pretty much disregard that last bit of criticism though, especially with the party from Chapter 14, Cloud, Tifa, and Barrett, as you can have two people build stagger and the third, usually Cloud, reserve his ATB for Infinity's End for during the stagger itself. But for those one or two man parties, effectively using the stagger period can be made at best inconvenient due to those reasons, and I personally took to just disregarding the mechanic entirely and just doing as much general damage as I could, or maybe like using a spell or something. And completely disregarding a core system is never what you want to incentivize your players to do, if that wasn't obvious. But of course, this is ignoring the issue of staggering bosses, but that will come when we actually discuss them, so hold your horses there. For now, I want to talk about the broken aggro system. When I made my video last year, I was very angry with it, and I still am to a degree, but now that I believe I understand it a bit better, I'm instead filled with a sense of disappointment. For those that don't know, aggro is short for the way that the enemy targets the party. You see it a lot in MMOs, where certain abilities in tank builds, that is builds that can take a lot of hits on purpose, have the effect of drawing enemy aggro, which makes the enemy attack them, which in turn protects the squishier members of the adventuring party. Or for an example a little closer to home, the Sentinel role in FF13 has that purpose as well with its provoke command, drawing enemy attacks to them and their Steel Guard! One of the most disappointing things about playing through Xenoblade Chronicles was that game's aggro system. For characters like Shulk or VII, whose game plan revolves around being able to hit the enemy from specific angles, either from the side or from behind, it really sucked to have to deal with the game's awful aggro system. From what I was able to surmise, it was based primarily on the raw damage that was dealt. So for Shulk's backslash technique, where it does absolutely bonkers damage, the enemy almost always immediately focused on him, and when enemies focus on a character, they slide and moonwalk however they have to keep that character in the center of their vision, cutting Shulk off from his damage potential. Why am I telling you this? Well, it seems to be the same deal here. While my testing amounted to just playing through the game and trying to be observant, it seemed to me that enemies were drawn to attack whoever was attacking them. So, if that happened to be an AI party member, they would target them. However, as we'll get into, that rarely happened. Yes, a lot of emphasis. More often than not, a smart player will be doing as much damage as possible to as many enemies as possible. In my case, mostly with Deadly Dodge, which has the unfortunate effect of drawing aggro almost entirely to whoever you're controlling. This, in addition to copious tracking attacks, means that in many cases, you feel like enemies are ganging up on you, and no character really has an answer to that. One of the worst encounters in the game, which is one of the initial ones as you go into the Shinra HQ garage, is a big offender of this. It just feels like you have no options. Physically attacking doesn't stagger them, and they have riot shield enemies which bounce your hits off anyway. You can't get an ability or spell off either because you'll just be hit out of it. Blocking only reduces the amount of damage you take, knocks you back, and it doesn't actually help you eliminate the enemies. And dodging is purely for repositioning. It doesn't have any invincibility frames. So, what do you do? The only real solution is to constantly switch characters, but this is where we get into the fact that aggro isn't consistent. Yes, for the most part, what I laid out earlier is true. The player character attacks the most, enemies zero in on them, and actually in addition, it seems that the AI prioritizes the player character even aside from that, but I still do think it's primarily based on the damage dealt. However, often for reasons I don't understand, different enemies change their target at different times, seemingly at random. I could be relentlessly attacking an enemy and they could completely ignore my character. I could be focusing on an entirely different enemy, and one guy halfway across the arena will suddenly decide to cheap shot me from behind or with a projectile. To summarize, this is a game with an incredibly fast-paced combat system in which you can't realistically understand how aggro functions at any given moment. This isn't nearly as much of a problem in other RPGs like Xenoblade Chronicles, where your party AI is actually somewhat competent, except for Melia, or Final Fantasy XIII for the same reason, or Final Fantasy XII, where you can still input any command manually at any time that you need, and you have complete control over your AI using the Gambit system. Or even with other action games like God of War, where the enemies only have one target. I think a decent solution, if they uncluttered the visuals a bit anyway, is to have a Three Houses style indicator of aggro, so if an enemy is targeting Cloud, there could be like a red line arcing up from the enemy to Cloud. That way, if an off-screen enemy is targeting him, the player could at least be made aware of that and react accordingly. Or alternatively, you could have something like in Dad of War, where there's a circle around Kratos and enemies are displayed as triangles, and when they're about to attack, the triangle flashes. Though, with some of the encounters having upwards of 12 enemies, it might get a bit too cluttered for that. As is though, there are just too many times where you get cheap-shotted out of a combo or ability for no reason. Of course, part of the issue is that the party AI is so bad. I laid out my reasons in the last video and several times in this one. They're incompetent. I unfortunately didn't get the footage for the last video, but in that first playthrough during the boss you fight with both Aerith and Barret, I switched to Barret, who was attacking, but his AI was so stupid that it couldn't recognize that he was behind a pillar where his shots weren't hitting the boss. More often, the AI party members will be slowly pacing the battlefield, just guarding. When they attack, it's rare to see them actually attempt a full combo. They aren't programmed to use abilities or magic at all, which you could argue for as they expend resources, but more egregiously, they don't even use their triangle commands, which cost nothing. Before Maximum Fury, Barret's overcharge is his best chance for decent damage, and you have to constantly switch to him to use it and make him even somewhat useful in battle. Cloud will never use Punisher mode, which is where most of his combo damage comes from, and by the same token, Aerith will never use Tempest. The only one where I would argue a character shouldn't use it is Tifa, whose triangle commands take away her charges that you have to expend ATB to build back up. But for the other three, there's not really an excuse in my opinion. This ties into how aggro doesn't work too, as because the AI is so non-aggressive and stupid, they can't do enough damage most of the time to actually draw any aggro, only exacerbating that system's many problems. I have absolutely nothing good to say about the party AI in this game. Even if they wanted this system to be the default settings, I don't understand why they couldn't have given us the ability to change their AI parameters. In a kind of gambit system like in Final Fantasy XII, though admittedly it would have to be very watered down from that system. And I honestly have very little to say about the enemy AI. I already went over my issues with how aggro functions, so all that's left to talk about are the enemy cycles. From what I can tell, any given enemy will do the exact same thing as every other enemy in a sequence. So the little Moldorm guys will almost always start the fight with their feast attack, for an example. This is fine if predictable, but where I take issue with is in the big enemies. They seem to go through phases of aggression, where sometimes they'll attack you relentlessly, and sometimes they'll take 11 years to decide to move slightly to the left. While this kind of system isn't inherently bad, I can't help but question its implementation. Very little care was taken to either properly balance the mechanic or to consider the context of how it happens. On the latter, I actually noticed it the most with the cutter robots, which, I mean, it's a robot. What kind of sentient AI does it have to regulate its functions, you know? On the former, it ties back to how powerless it makes the player feel. For a brief moment, I want to jump over to Monster Hunter, which I'm aware is a very different game, but bear with me for a sec. The series actually implements this kind of mechanic as well, where the monsters will start out neutral, grow enraged after enough damage is dealt or enough time passes, and then they tire out. When they're enraged, they're faster and do more damage, but when they're tired, they rarely attack and are more susceptible to being toppled. But what's great about the rage mechanic is that your options aren't strictly limited while they're in that state. If you know the monster, you can just as easily keep attacking it during this phase, and potentially knock it out of its enraged state faster if you do enough damage. You have just as many answers to the monster in this state as you do normally. It's just a matter of tempo, which alters the difficulty of executing said commands. If we go back to the Final Fantasy VII Remake, when a big enemy becomes enraged, for lack of a better term, you don't have any options. Because of the lack of proper hit stun, your piss-poor defensive options, and the broken aggro system, your options are heavily limited. Basically, you can run away and potentially avoid attacks, or you can block and take reduced damage. Trying to attack the enemy is a complete non-option, as you'll just constantly be hit away. With Cloud, you can potentially counter them, but for some attacks, such as the Cutter's standard double swipe, the counter's block state doesn't last long enough to sustain for the second hit, which means you just eat damage with very little reward for doing so. Speaking of eating damage, most bosses rely on you to do that at various points. To talk about the boss design in any given detail would mostly be going over the same ground with AI, aggro, general flow of combat, the works. However, bosses tweak and mess with several of these systems in little ways that make them interesting, just not in a particularly good way. One of the criticisms that I leveled at the game in that first video was that the bosses have way too much health, and I more or less stand by that. For a first playthrough, if you're like me and were wholly unimpressed with all of the flashing lights and pretty colors, colors, then these battles dragged and dragged and dragged until I wanted to rip my hair out for some of them, like that one I mentioned earlier with Barrett and Aerith. They fare better on repeat playthroughs when you can better maximize your damage output, but then we get to my single biggest problem with their design. In most action games, enemies don't have health bars. They obviously do have a set amount of health that attacks take away from, but the player usually isn't aware of that. Part of me wished that this game was more along those lines. Why? Recently, Tetsuya Nomura has gotten into a nasty habit of putting long, unskippable cutscenes in the middle of his boss fights to denote phase changes. Never mind that things would flow better with like a single shockwave to force the player to acknowledge it and then move on from there, or make like Sekiro and have entirely separate health bars for each phase. Or, you know, any number of other, more elegant solutions than this. Yes, almost without fail, each boss has at least one mid-battle cutscene that takes for ever, during which the boss does some attack or changes forms or whatever. And without fail, I hated every single one. Nothing feels worse than taking all of your time and energy to build the stagger meter with the perfect resource management, staggering the boss, and then unleashing your big attack only for it to deal the equivalent of 20 damage because that was the HP threshold for the boss to enter the second phase. I cannot stand that. And let's say you knew that the phase change was coming, so you intentionally build the stagger meter to only stagger the boss directly after the phase change so that you can blow right through that second phase with your big attacks. That would promote something called strategy, and it would be really cool, except each phase change completely resets the stagger bar to 0. Nice. Way to ruin your one good system by making it essentially pointless. Even doing everything you can to build stagger efficiently, you're almost always going to be on the threshold of the phase change when you finally do actually stagger the boss, and by then, it'll be wasted. What a great system with really well thought out mechanics, am I right? But then that stupid remark could apply to the entire combat system. If these issues could be ironed out, if your party could build ATB, if the party AI was fixed or customizable, if the aggro system was tweaked, and if the bosses got rid of those moronic mid-battle cutscenes, I think that there's a really good, really fun combat system buried somewhere in here. It isn't like this is an old NES side-scroller. There is depth to be found here. You just have to get through a whole lot of bullshit to find it. To rattle off some fixes, first, get rid of those cutscenes, or don't have them reset the stagger bar at the very least. And don't completely shut off damage you would do with a big attack over the HP threshold. Second, if you're going to have non-staggerable enemies, and with not as tight of combat as Monster Hunter or Dark Souls, add an instant defensive option a la God of War. It would do wonders for helping relieve pressure gained from the aggro and the AI issues. Finally, add a goddamn jump button. Yeah, this will be my final note on the combat system as a whole. I didn't really have a good place to slot this complaint in before, though this particular one could go here or go into the pacing and progression section as well. But basically, when fighting an aerial enemy, you don't have control over whether your character jumps. Instead, if Cloud or Tifa are locked onto an aerial enemy, they will leap 80 feet into the air, hover there for the length of their combo, and then drop back to the ground like a rock. The problem? Flying enemies are routinely programmed to constantly move away from you. Both Cloud and Tifa's aerial combos have very little lateral motion, so what's likely to happen is that you hit them once, they hover out of range, and then you just look like a dumbass flailing around in the air. As well, there were times when an enemy would become stuck or would hover just off the ground. Just high enough to where ground combos missed them most of the time, but low enough that it didn't trigger the jump attack animation. Great. Thanks. Please add a jump button. And as for how it ties into exploration, therefore the pacing and progression, well, there are multiple examples of puzzles and or detours that the party has to embark on because of a 4-foot gap, namely in the sewers in Chapter 10. But the characters can leap up like 80 feet. They can't make that jump? This kind of thing absolutely broke me on my first playthrough, both that 4-foot gap in the sewer and the flying enemies I had to fight shortly after on the tower. I was stabbing my finger at the screen and hurling curses like no tomorrow, which I'd never do. Thankfully, I have moved past that absolute hatred and have replaced it with regular bitching. Speaking of hard mode. Having a hard mode in this game was a questionable decision. After my first playthrough, I thought it would be like walking through hell. Now, as I went to record this playthrough for this video and make notes and really analyze the game, I saw that it had potential. One of the things that made the boss fights boring, in addition to their other problems, was that most weren't even that threatening. If the bosses do more damage, I thought, maybe that would incentivize me to use all of the different systems and magics to gain an edge. It would make me learn the fights. That's why I love critical mode in Kingdom Hearts 2 after all. What's not to love? Unfortunately, Final Fantasy VII Remake has the worst hard mode I've ever experienced. I would never say that it's too hard when that would be an insult to games that really genuinely challenge you. Final Fantasy VII Remake's hard mode is just cheap and broken. To go over what hard mode is, it's a variation on a New Game Plus. You can only access it by loading a completed save file and selecting a previous chapter in the menu, at which point you'll be prompted for a difficulty, though if you do a chapter replay, you will still move seamlessly to the next chapter like you were just playing through it normally, so you don't have to just keep going into the chapter select, so don't worry about that. Second, it makes all of the enemies do bonkers damage, gives them bonkers health, and it gives the bosses new attacks, apparently. The latter I hardly noticed, but I did do my hard mode run almost a full year after my previous one, so my memory was hazy at best. Third, it makes it so you can't use consumable items. Ever, not just in battle. So, all those elixirs and turbo ethers you have, you can sell them. Fourth, all of those blue benches that are scattered around Midgar, in normal mode they refilled both HP and MP to full, but they don't refill MP in hard mode, and that's it. 4 changes is enough to ruin the game completely. I'm actually kind of impressed that they found the perfect storm of bad decisions to make an already bad game even worse, but hey, they did it. So what do these changes mean for the gameplay? Well, basically, you can't really use magic. Even with post-game stats and equipment, you'll only have like 100 MP, maybe 150 if you have a good level for MP up, and third tier magic costs 12 MP per cast. You can't really use first or second tier spells either, as they don't do nearly enough damage to justify the cost, so at most, with Aerith, I was able to cast Firaga like 10 times per chapter. Other magic like Haste or Barrier, those should be really good if you want to maximize your combat potential for the harder fights, right? Well, yeah, but they don't even last a single encounter. Why use them if they're just going to use up precious MP? You could use them on the boss, but even with the duration boosts, they both run out so quickly that it's hardly ever worth it. Really, the only saving grace in hard mode is the prayer materia, which heals the entire party for 2 ATB bars and no MP cost, leaving all the MP that you do have on offensive spells to help chunk the enemies and bosses' massive HP bars. And it's a real shame, because I could see what they were going for here. They were trying to make the game all about MP management, about really considering the value of the spells you were casting, but they took it a step too far for it to actually be a good test of such. I don't agree with the no items rule at all. I completely understand not being able to use items in battle, but I see no reason not to be able to heal with potions after the fact. Maybe make it so ethers are unusable though, if you want to stick with the whole MP management idea. While I would also suggest that the benches go back to refilling MP, as they're placed now, I can't really ask for that. If they were placed intelligently, like some of the better bonfires in Dark Souls, I would be gung-ho for that rework, but right now there's a bench before pretty much every boss, which would defeat the point of the challenge. I would instead suggest that enemies refill MP again, but they should also remove half of them, specifically the ones before bosses, or put them right after the bosses instead. So you could have one after the Anzu fight in chapter 10, or the Ghoul in chapter 11, where there's still a lot of level left to explore, and you already beat one of the big challenges. You're starting over for the second phase of the level, if that makes sense. To throw out some other random examples, take out any that are in connecting portions between the settlements, and take out the ones in the mini dungeons, such as the one in the factory in Sector 7. For sections with a lot of side quests, you could also limit the number of times you can rest at it in the town. So you still have to manage your MP through multiple excursions into the field at a time, but you still have some leeway. Say you can use the bench to refill MP once every 3 side quests completed or something like that. If tweaked properly, I think this would be a much better system than what we have currently. And I'll be honest, I gave up on it. Remember back at the beginning when I said I've gone through this game 4 times now in terms of game time? Well, I only have 3 completed files. One is from my initial playthrough, where I had to start over from switching PS4s and profiles, so that's 1.5 for the completed one on the new profile, and the old one that isn't completed on the old profile. Then I have my second playthrough to give the combat another try, which I also mentioned, and then I have my most recent playthrough, so that's 3.5, but the last half was my hard mode attempt. I made it to Hell House, and from there I looked at the writing on the wall and concluded that forcing myself to go any farther would be a massive waste of my time for very little benefit. Of course, I also ranted to my friend for like half an hour before I came to that conclusion, but still. From my time playing, really highlighted the flaws of the system, specifically that it was very clearly designed for a 3-person party. Sections where you're alone or with one other person just flat out didn't work with the increased damage, and I found myself spamming deadly dodge more and more just to survive. As well, it just generally sucked not to have a true hard mode, as in you start from the beginning and level up like normal. Most guides I looked at in my fool's quest to beat Hell House recommended that you grind to max level and get all of your relevant materia to max level as well before you even start hard mode. If you went that far, you're not even playing an RPG of any kind once you start the hard mode run. It's literally just an action game where you occasionally swap equipment. I personally got to level 50, the max level, a bit into chapter 6, and my materia was leveling up like crazy as well, both from the increased EXP and AP yield that comes with a completed file, and I assume from the way those numbers are also scaled to your level and or difficulty, which I know is a thing, as enemies you fight earlier give you one amount, and those same enemies that you fight later give more. It could also have to do with what chapter they're fought in as well as difficulty, though not your own level, but I do not have the patience to test that, and ultimately it doesn't really matter. And of course, the same criticisms I laid out before apply here. Broken aggro, bad party AI, copious bullshit tracking attacks and off-screen projectiles, and little to no hit stun on your moves. It's all just worse on hard mode due to how much more punishing each little bit of bullshit is. Again, I almost have to be impressed. They made the perfect storm of badness. Most of my opinions about this game have remained the same from last year to today, putting it at around a 6 out of 10 or 4 out of 10 if including the whispers, but since the only thing I did differently this time around was hard mode, and hard mode sucks, my overall opinion of the game actually lowered to a 5. 3 with whispers. It's literally the worst attempt at a hard mode I've ever had to deal with. As we go. So I don't plan on spending a whole lot of time discussing the minutiae of the game's chapters. The movement system and level design aren't interesting enough to justify it, and to talk about combat and pacing anymore would just be repeating myself. However, just to say I covered my bases, I will talk about them anyway and point out things that are interesting to me, I guess. It'll be brief though, so you can consider this a lightning round. Chapter 1. Pretty good introduction, even though the game's main issues are cropping up already. The boss takes too long, Barrett absolutely sucks as a party member this early, his tirade in the elevator, while carried over from the original game, feels really forced and out of place when they're supposed to be sneaking around the facility, and the characters in general feel way too lax about the whole endeavor. As well, Jesse having to point out that Cloud doing a cool thing was cool when they're supposed to be running away from the reactor explosion is one of the single worst attempts at character I can imagine. Chapter 2. Boring as snot, and this is where they pull the Sephiroth card first. There's an extended sequence of slowly following the vision of the Edgelord, and I hated every second of that, and fighting alone as Cloud never feels good. This is also where you get the deadly dodge and meet Aerith for the first time, so yay. Chapter 3. Side quest introduction, and it's an overall decent chapter. Tifa is one of the best characters with the biggest narrative glow-ups from the remake, and getting to use her for the first time helps mitigate the usual boringness of tutorials and baby tier missions. Johnny is the worst character in the game, and no, Yuri Lowenthal cannot save that. On the plus side, we got darts! Chapter 4. One of the best chapters, honestly. While the excuse for it is weak at best, that Jesse needs to steal a weaker blasting agent for the next bomb, getting to know her and the other Z-list Avalanche members was some of the best character work in the game. It's also the only time where fighting alone felt good because it was either against a boss like Roche, or the enemies were fodder in droves, which were fairly easily dealt with, or they were focused on Wedge's dumbass. It also gave us a more controlled, tutorialized introduction to the motorcycle minigame that will return at the end, and And the parachute scene was a fantastic callback to the airdrop into Midgar that happens at the end of the original game. Overall, really great stuff, and it stands out as the one quote-unquote filler chapter that felt like it really belonged in the narrative. Chapter 5. Kind of shit. For those who don't like the hallways from Final Fantasy XIII, prepare yourselves. The enemies were boring, there was no interesting twist on gameplay other than that this is the first time you have 3 party members, and the webbed doors are just about the worst excuse for a blockage I can imagine. Like, just run through it, guys. The boss was also really bad, with horrible hit detection on its big lightning attack, and many attacks that hit all sides multiple times. Plus, it had one of the worst, most cluttered boss arenas in the game, making the whole encounter a slog at best and outright painful at worst, i.e., on hard mode. The only bright spot is the scene at the beginning where Cloud helps Tifa jump from the train, which is a great character moment for the both of them and helps solidify their relationship and make it more believable why Tifa would put so much stock in this introverted weirdo. Chapter 6. The second worst chapter of the game. The level is confusing for a first-time player. Now, level design can be complicated, but even mildly intricate paths coupled with this cluttered mess of an area doesn't make for a good mix. You also fight repeat enemies from the last chapter, and it has the single worst excuse for padding in the game. To power a single elevator, you have to siphon power away from 3 artificial suns. Of course, there's also no boss, so you don't even get a cool encounter to look forward to, and there's also copious slowdowns, such as when you're trying to cross in front of the fans, making the only interesting thing in this entire chapter is that this is where you get the elemental materia, and it's the only time that you find a summon materia just kind of lying around in the field. Chapter 7. While it's one of the more interesting chapters narratively, as it's really the first big tension spike in the game, this chapter is also pretty trash. Again, repeat enemies, this time from chapters 1 and 2, and several nearly identical treks up hallways and into rooms where you dispose of some of the boss's kit. It's an interesting concept to choose how you want to debilitate the boss, but I'm not convinced that it matters much, as I got rid of all of its big bomber things, and it still used it on me in the fight, so... The boss is also one of the worst offenders of bad phase changes in this game, and has a really bullshit attack in hard mode, where it uses its big cannon twice in a row, and the second time locks onto your character and almost always hits you. For an unblockable attack that almost always one-shots every character, I'd consider that a problem unless I'm missing something. If so, I would still blame the game for the most part for poorly communicating what I should be doing to avoid that attack. Chapter 8. One of the most boring chapters in the game. The tension drop was taken about 3 steps too far for me, and that Cloud wouldn't immediately rush to go back to Tifa is kind of ridiculous with how they've recharacterized him here. All of the side quests are also bad in terms of gameplay, which was also true in Chapter 3, but that was also the introduction to them, so I gave it a pass. The Reno and Rude bosses are also some of the most disappointing in the game, though in Rude's phase change, when you break his sunglasses and he pulls a spare set of sunglasses to replace them, had me laughing on the floor the first time I played. I also have to wonder, with how they've expanded Sector 5 into being like a full community, why hasn't anyone asked Aerith or Elmira to use all of that excess land that they have to, you know, build some houses for people? I don't know, that's a nitpick though. Chapter 9. This is a chapter that starts off horribly, but gets much better as it goes along. All of the trek to Wall Market is absolutely terrible, with bad enemies, boring as snot crane puzzles, and that incredibly awkward prompt for the slowest high five in existence. But everything once you get to Wall Market is insanely enjoyable. It was already the most bizarre part of the original game by far, and I felt that the remake handled the entire section both tastefully and hilariously. Nailed it, I know, thank you, moving on has become something of a meme for a reason, but even beyond the obvious, I found the 3 main helpers fun and interesting. The layout of Wall Market is easily the most intricately designed zone in the game. It's full of personality, especially at night, and everything weird and fun that was in the original game remains intact in some form or another. The only weak link in the whole scenario is Leslie, who stands out as the most boring original character, including some of the more prominent side quest dispensers like Mirie and Chadley. My biggest issue was that the dance wasn't just a cutscene, as that was quite possibly the worst rhythm minigame interface I've ever seen. Again, Tetsuya Nomura takes his usual route of prioritizing visual flair over comprehensibility. Also, dude, you don't have to have belly jiggle physics for Corneo if you're not gonna have boob physics for Tifa's knockers. Come on. But hey, this is where my hard mode run failed, so you know what that means. Hit it!
Yeah, this is big brain time.
Did I ever tell you the definition of insanity?
Cloud, up top. We did it!
And the winners and champions, Cloud and Aaron!
Chapter 10. Probably my third worst. Sewer levels always suck, and that's no different here. And while the switch around of having the boss at the beginning is cool and all, the game is obsessed with ending off each chapter with intense action beats, and so came up with that terrible Sahagin ambush which just utterly fell flat. The most interesting thing about the chapter is that you get the feathered gloves for Tifa, which give the Star Shower ability, which is 100% her best one of the game. Chapter 11. If there ever was a chapter to not include, it would be this one. It should be a mad sprint to get back to the plate before the Turks blow it up, but instead we have a slow slog through the haunted train yard. And while the story about the lost children and the ghosts is mildly interesting in a vacuum, that they only used it to showcase how Aerith isn't like the other girls was absolutely infuriating. It's also where you get the rod, which has her Ray of Judgment's ability. This chapter is also unique in that it has two bosses, sure, but both of them suck, so we're moving on. Chapter 12. What should be one of the best chapters is actually my least favorite by a country mile. You do the majority of it alone with Cloud, you have to fight a ton of aerial enemies, and the whole thing is just the same boring layout repeated like 12 times with different enemies. There's also the boss, which is a rematch with Reno and Rude together at once, but having two bosses at once to deal with is a terrible idea as they both just end up ganging up on you. As well, there's a horrible section with Aerith where nothing interesting happens. This part of the story did not need to be told in such detail. And that whole thing with Wedge was the prime example of the horrible voice acting job of the character. And that's a shame, as otherwise it actually pretty effectively showed the gray morality of the Shinra soldiers. How they're just following orders, but at the end of the day, they're still humans who want to do the right thing. As well, the Whispers rear their ugly heads here and prevent the party from stopping the fall of the plate, which was also absolutely infuriating. Jesse had a good death though. Too bad it couldn't stick for the other two. Chapter 13. Barrett finally gets his maximum fury ability just in time for you to be able to play with him solo. Unfortunately, the boss and area as a whole are very underwhelming. I wish, instead of that failed experiment, that the optional Behemoth boss was used here instead, as it is much more interesting overall. The whole underground research facility is also really stupid. They even ask in-game how Shinra could have built it right under their noses without them noticing, and I have to ask the same thing. I mean, come on, it wasn't even deep underground. It was like 30 feet or something. Chapter 14. Another slog through the sewers. Great. And we get to do it with Leslie. Great. A repeated boss in Anzu? Great. Yeah, maybe I have to retract my statement about Chapter 11, or at least add an addendum. This chapter also should have been cut for sure. Leslie isn't interesting or important enough of a character to justify this much time put into his story, and the reuse of a dungeon and boss is pretty poor form for an RPG this short. From there, you have a bunch of side quests. I blitzed through them in about 2 hours, and none of them were worth it. Chapter 15. Features some of the most striking colors in the game, and the tone is rightfully somber and tense throughout the whole thing. I also like how it has you being pursued by the boss throughout the level, and it has some of the more interesting and layered level design in the game, rewarding players with goodies for noticing alternate paths. Unfortunately, there are a lot of flying enemies. The new robots you fight have a repelling field when they get staggered, making them annoying to fight, and the section right before the boss is horrible, as the Valkyrie's shots don't seem to be spaced out properly to avoid them. Finally, this is the worst example of a shitty JPEG background. The characters even pointed out, and all I could do was laugh when they did, which is not what they were going for, I'm sure. Chapter 16. While the world building and propaganda are interesting in a vacuum, this chapter is a total pacebreaker. Granted, the original game's infiltration isn't really any better with its weird timing and word puzzles and boring switch placement crap, but it was at least shorter overall. Also, Hojo sicks his big Cthulhu monster on you, you kill it, and then when you go into the next room, you're met with a group of like 5 regular dudes, and Hojo is all like, "From my calculations, these guys should totally be able to kill you," when you just killed his big Cthulhu monster. Come on, poor form. Finally, they introduce a second arena challenge with the VR crap, and it's just, why? This is supposed to be part of the big tense finale, and you're still introducing side crap? I mean, on the plus side, I absolutely love climbing the stairs and the banter is great, but is that worth it? No. Finally, console name drop for us Crisis Core stands. A+ on that one, Nomura. Chapter 17. Speaking of breaking the pace. Again, 2-man teams don't really work for this game, though admittedly the enemies are scaled down to compensate at least, and the boss is utter trash. How does it even fly? Never mind. The main gimmick of switching between 2-man parties is interesting, again, in a vacuum, but the justification is that you're just going through test chambers for Hojo, and how does this place even make sense? It's on like the 70th floor when it looks like it's underground, and on the outside, the building had windows on every floor, so I don't know. And besides, how does Shinra people even get around here if there are no consistent pathways between the test chambers? Or rather, how did they even build it? Whatever. Moving out of there, you also have the Genova Dreamweaver boss, which was only alright. The Whispers bringing Barrett back to life, which sucked. And the proper explanation of the Whispers, which you already know my opinion on. The actual end boss of Rufus Shinra is annoying when dealing with both him and his pets, but after that, he's easily beaten with counterstance. There's also the other actual boss, the Arsenal, which is the single worst boss in the game. A multi-stage gauntlet with only your 2 worst DPS characters to play as? No thanks! Chapter 18. starting with a motorcycle sequence with one too many phases, and all that's really left are the final bosses. First, you fight Pudding and his little minions, and then you move briskly onto Sephiroth. He moves too fast for how quickly you can react to things in the game's system, and that you can't reliably know which party of 3 you'll be fighting him with is atrocious. Due to the game's affection mechanic, you could basically have any party, so good luck fixing your materia. Thankfully, he's still not that hard. The final cutscenes blow, implying Zack lives through his final stand, at least in an alternate timeline. It's revealed that Biggs is alive, and a bunch of other stuff for sequel bait. The only interesting things about it are that Pudding's minions are supposed to be based on the 3 Sephiroth wannabes from Advent Children, according to official sources, and that Bike Boss has a more interesting stagger mechanic than the whole rest of the game, where continuing to hit it after you stagger it actually increases the damage multiplier. Huh. Kinda like some other game I know. It's a much better game too, and God, I wish I had played that game. Conclusion. The statement I've made at several points about several things really holds true for the whole product. It had potential. One advantage about a game this successful is that it's guaranteed to have a sequel, and I truly hope that it fixes at least some of the issues. I really wanted to like this game. My brother pre-ordered it, and when it came 3 days late, I actually bought it for myself on PlayStation Store because I wanted to play it that bad. I really wanted to love this game, but it severely disappointed me. Fix the issues with the gameplay though, and we'll already have a solid head start in getting a truly great product. We have good characters, we're done with story setup, and hopefully we don't have to see any more of those damn whispers. I myself won't be trying the recently announced Yuffie expansion for PS5, because I don't have a PS5, but I hope that works out well too. Will I play the sequel? Yes. After making 2 multi-hour long videos and committing to 4 playthroughs, you could consider me invested or otherwise suffering from Stockholm Syndrome, despite that I don't like this game. And guys, I really hope the next one is good. If you want to pick this game up to try for yourself, now is about the perfect time to do so, as that Yuffie expansion is being released bundled with the PS5 re-release, so you'll only benefit from trying it now. And I really do think you should pick it up to draw your own conclusions and become a part of the phenomenon. Support good creators, and despite everything, I do believe that this game was made by good creators. Even my arch enemy, Tetsuya Nomura. Overall, personal bias aside, Final Fantasy VII Remake is a decent game with a combat system which has the potential for good depth. It has well-realized characters, fantastic models, and an even better soundtrack, as well as a solid voice cast from what I understand both in English and in the original Japanese. However, the combat frustrated me to no end. I personally didn't like one of the core characters, the side quests and navigation are trash, and the overall plotline is just as stupid as before, only now told through a super serious lens and HD graphics. Is that it? Is the video over? Or am I now cursed until I make videos on every single one of the remake games to be released? Boy oh boy, the price of freedom is steep. But really, it could cost something more than that, couldn't it? Thank you for watching. Like, comment, and subscribe. Until the end, my friends.
I would be lost, drifting along.